Significantly, he added to the song the phrase, "In the year of decision, 1922. Eckhart and his peers in the leadership of the NSDAP clearly lived in anticipation of an imminent Italian-style takeover of Bavaria, which would then spread to the rest of Germany, led by Bavaria's Mussolini, Adolf Hitler. Chapter 11. The German Girl from New York. Winter 1922 to summer 1923. As Christmas 1922 passed, it was clear that, contrary to Dietrich Eckhart's expectations as expressed in the guest book of the Schwarzenbachs, 1922 would not be the year of decision. However, in the new year an event took place that, while not bringing about a political transformation, was of the utmost importance to Adolf Hitler, for it would provide him with a home away from home. And it would reveal who in Munich would open their doors to him, and who would at best merely see him as a political tool with which to further their own interests. The event occurred on a day in early 1923, when Hitler boarded a tram that ran from Schwabing, Munich's art district, to central Munich. On the tram, he bumped into Ernst Hofstangl, a German-American dealer of art reproductions and Harvard graduate who in 1921 had moved back to Germany, and his wife, Helena. Ernst Hofstangl was excited finally to have a chance to introduce his wife to Hitler. The Harvard man had first encountered the leader of the NSDAP after a speech Hitler had given in November, when he introduced himself to Hitler. Hofstangl had been utterly taken by Hitler's masterful command of his voice and his superb use of innuendo, mocking humor, and irony during his speech. On returning home, Hofstangl had talked about nothing but his encounter with Hitler, raving to his wife about this earnest, magnetic young man. Since then, he and Hitler had seen each other a few times. Helena eagerly invited her husband's object of fascination to come to their apartment at Genstrasse 1 for lunch or dinner at his convenience. Hitler was all too happy to accept that invitation. From his first visit to the Hofstangls, where he immediately felt at home, he came more or less daily to their apartment. The very frequency of Hitler's visits to their three-room sublet provides a glimpse of what had been lacking from his life. By early 1923, Hitler might have found a political home, but beyond that he was still the isolated person he had been in 1919, who desperately had been trying to find a surrogate family in Munich. Had he previously found a home, and had the city's middle and upper-class society opened its doors to him, Hitler's transition to becoming a part of the life of the Hofstangls no doubt would have been more gradual. But he had found neither the kind of home where he could just be himself, nor genuine social interactions with Munich's middle and upper classes. The only other surrogate home he had found was with Hermine Hoffmann, an elderly widow of a teacher and early member of the party living in a suburb of Munich, whom he visited often and to whom he referred, using the affectionate southern German diminutive term for mother, as his Mutter. Despite Ernst Hofstangl's subsequent fame, which would stem from the books and articles that he would write about his time with Hitler, his wife was far more emotionally important to Hitler. Throughout his visits, Hitler felt drawn to the 29-year-old blonde, slim and tall, taller than Hitler himself, who saw herself as a German girl from New York. For Hitler, she was, as subsequently he was to recall, so beautiful that next to her everything else just vanished. While for Helena, the leader of the NSDAP was a warm man who, as she would recall later in her life, had a great habit of opening his big blue eyes and using them. Born and raised in New York, Helena's German parents had always spoken in German to her, even though she insisted that her feelings were those of a German, not an American. She had a mixed identity. She said that sometimes she was thinking in German and sometimes in English. To everyone in Munich she was simply the Amerikanerin, the American woman. It was thus with the Amerikanerin, someone who, like Hitler, was a German from abroad and who also had made Munich her home without really belonging there, that he felt at ease. Whether or not he was sexually attracted to Helena, her apartment started to be his home in Munich. As she prepared lunches for him in the improvised kitchen that she and her husband had erected behind a makeshift wall in the foyer of their apartment, or as Hitler dissolved squares of chocolate in his black coffee, Hitler and Helena got to know each other well. At times, he talked with her about his plans for the future of the party and of Germany, or he simply sat quietly in a corner, reading or taking notes. At other times, he reenacted incidents from his past in a realistic manner, revealing his gift and love for drama, or simply played with Helena's 2-year-old son Egon, to whom he soon became very dedicated, patting him and showing him his affection. Every time he visited her apartment, Egon ran to the door to welcome Uncle Dolph. To Helena, Hitler was not the rising star and orator of a political party, but a slim, shy young man with a faraway look in his very blue eyes, who was dressed shabbily in cheap white shirts, black ties, a worn dark blue suit with a non-matching dark brown leather vest, and cheap black shoes, who outside her apartment wore a beige-colored trench coat, much the worse for wear, and a soft old grayish hat. This was a characterization that would have been immediately recognizable to other women who encountered the private Hitler. In the words of Ilse Prull, Rudolf Hess's future wife, who described Hitler as shy, too, he was very, very polite. That was the Austrian in him. In one of their many conversations, Hitler admitted to Helena that as a child he had wanted to be a preacher, that he would put his mother's apron around him like a surplice, climb on top of a stool in the kitchen, and pretend to sermonize at length. Possibly without realizing it, he was revealing to Helena Hofstangl not only that he traced his urge to speak to crowds back to his earliest childhood, but that he ultimately preferred to talk at, rather than with, people. Apparently, from an early age, he viewed connecting with others as a one-way process. As Helena observed, even when only she and her husband were around and Hitler talked, he walked up and down. It seemed to her that Hitler's body must move in accordance with his thoughts. The more intense his speech becomes, the quicker he moved about. Hitler told Helena about his relationship with his parents, but never mentioned his siblings, not even their very existence, and he only occasionally talked about his time prior to his move to Vienna. Unlike with people in the party, he did not become cross when she asked him about his past. However, even though he was happy to talk about his adolescence in Austria and about his life since moving to Munich, he did not really talk to her about his experiences in Vienna. The only reference to his time in the Austrian capital occurred in his frequent rants against the city's Jews. In 1971, she observed, he was really very cagey about saying what he really did in Vienna. Helena believed that something personal must have happened to Hitler in Vienna, for which he blamed the Jews, which he could not, or did not, want to talk about. He built it up, this hatred. I often heard him raving about Jews, absolutely personal, not just a political thing. Helena Hofstangl may well have been right. It was not just that he did not want to talk to anyone about his Vienna years, but also he kept misdating his move to Munich. All evidence suggests that Hitler did not arrive in Munich before 1913, yet in an article for the Völkischer Beobachter in April 12, 1922, he claimed to have moved from Vienna to Munich in 1912. He made the same claim during his trial following the failed coup of 1923. Hitler did not simply make the same mistake twice, as, in a brief biographical sketch he had included in a letter he wrote to Emil Ganser, the party's chief fundraiser abroad, in 1921, he made the identical claim. And he would do so again in 1925 to Austrian authorities when requesting to be released from Austrian citizenship. It has never conclusively been resolved why Hitler deliberately predated his arrival in Munich by a year. Although Helena was closer emotionally to Hitler than her husband was, Ernst became ever more important to Hitler, too, throughout 1923. He introduced him to American football and college songs from Harvard, which Hitler loved. According to Ernst, the Sieg Heil, used subsequently in all Nazi rallies and political meetings, was a direct copy of the technique used by cheerleaders in American football. Furthermore, Ernst Hofstangl offered his business expertise as well as his experiences of America to Hitler's movement. For instance, Ernst took a particular interest in the Völkischer Beobachter and persuaded Hitler to enlarge the paper to an American-size page. Neither his family background in Munich, where he had grown up as a child and teenager, nor his time spent on the other side of the Atlantic had made him a natural, almost inevitable convert to Hitler's movement. His parents, who had been friends with Mark Twain, had a cosmopolitan outlook. The reason that he was drawn to Hitler in the first place had little to do with feelings of guilt over having stayed in the United States during the First World War, or an urge to compensate for the loss of his brother in the war. In fact, Ernst Hofstangl had felt at home in America. He was married to a German girl from New York, had spent the previous decade intermingling with American upper-crust society, and was half American by birth. His mother was American. Furthermore, his other brother, Edgar, who had lost a brother in the war just as much as Ernst had been one of the founding members of the Munich chapter of the liberal German Democratic Party after the war. At Harvard, Hanfi, as he was known at the time, had been at the center of the university's social life, charming and entertaining his classmates and their families with his witty and funny stories and musical performances, which earned him invitations to their homes, including one to the White House, thanks to his friendship with classmate Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. Upon leaving Harvard, he had taken over the American branch of the family's art reproduction business on Fifth Avenue. There had been a time, in 1917 and 1918, when Hofstangl indeed could not have left the United States for Germany even if he had so wished. At the time, after the American entry into the war, due to his family's German ties, the art business on Fifth Avenue had been confiscated and ultimately sold off. And yet, even after the war, Hofstangl had not returned to Germany as soon as he legally could. During his continued presence in America after the war, Hofstangl had not displayed guilt over having stayed on the western side of the Atlantic Ocean during the war, and there is no sign that he believed he had betrayed his brother fallen in the First World War. Rather than rush back to Germany after the war, Ernst Hofstangl had set up a thriving new business of his own on 57th Street, right opposite Carnegie Hall. In post-war Manhattan, he had enjoyed serving the famous, rich, and powerful of America, including Charlie Chaplin, J.P. Morgan, Jr., and the daughter of President Woodrow Wilson, and taking his meals at the Harvard Club with Franklin D. Roosevelt, the 1920 vice presidential candidate, and others. Only 3 years after the war did Hofstangl finally decide to return to Germany. In short, there was little in the recent history of Hofstangl and his family to set him on a path that would lead into Hitler's arms. Moreover, rather than distance himself from U.S. politics, ideals, and institutions, he had been socially as close as one could possibly be to the American political establishment of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, though he had a preference for the former over the latter. Once back in Munich, rather than committing himself to avenging the wartime death of his brother, he had studied history and worked on a film script with the Eastern European Jewish writer Rudolf Kommer, whom he had known from his time in New York City, and who, like him, had moved back to Europe and now lived in southern Bavaria. Obviously, Hofstangl would not have started to associate with Hitler had he found the core of his ideas deeply repulsive. But going by his track record and by his character and personality, he seems to have been attracted by Hitler's movement first and foremost because it offered him excitement and adventure in a city and a political class that must have felt like a parochial village after his years at Harvard and in New York City. Hofstangl's historical role also did not lie in opening the doors for Hitler to Munich's upper-class society, as his ability to open doors for Hitler to the city's establishment was limited. He was only marginally part of it himself, as evident in the fact that after more than a decade in America, he spoke German with a German-American accent. and he could hardly turn to his brother in the liberal German Democratic Party and ask him to arrange for Hitler to be introduced to Munich's upper-class society. Rather, Ernst Hufstangl helped Hitler gain entry to the small American and German-American community in Munich, arranging meetings with such men as William Bayard Hale and German-American painter Wilhelm Funck. Like Hufstangl, Hale was a Harvard man, and he had been a European correspondent for the Hearst Press. After his work as a wartime German propagandist, Hale had been ostracized in the United States and thus lived in retirement in the Hotel Bayerischer Hof in Munich. And it was at Funk's salon that, according to Hufstangl, Hitler met Prince Guido Henkel von Donnersmarck, an Upper Silesian high aristocrat, son of a Russian mother, one of Germany's wealthiest men, whose family seat lay in the part of Silesia lost to Poland. He now lived in Rotatjägern on Tegernsee, in the foothills of the Alps. The only Munich family of note to whom Hufstangl seems to have introduced Hitler was that of Friedrich August von Kaulbach, the former director of the Munich Art Academy and a well-known painter who had died in 1920. Even Kaulbach's widow, Frida, was hardly a native Bavarian. A Dane from Copenhagen, she had traveled the world as a violin virtuoso, and after falling in love with Kaulbach, who was 21 years her senior, she had made Munich her home. In 1925, one of their daughters, Mathilda von Kaulbach, would marry Max Beckmann, who, in the eyes of National Socialists, would become the epitome of a producer of degenerate art. Despite his friend's best efforts, Hitler remained largely shut out of the social life of Munich's indigenous upper and upper-middle classes, and so failed to gain new and wealthy patrons in Munich's high society in 1923. The Hufstangl household, meanwhile, became the social center for a number of Hitler's associates who, like him and the Hufstangls, had not been born in Germany or had lived abroad for many years. Helena soon was particularly close to Hermann Göring's new bride, who had first met Hitler in October 1922 and had become the wife of the head of the SA in December. The Swedish-born Karin Göring, whose mother was Irish and who also had German ancestors on her father's side, spent many an hour in the company of the German girl from New York, either at the Hufstangls' apartment or in the presence of their respective husbands in the drinking and smoking room below the dining room, accessible through a trapdoor in the floor, in Göring's house in one of Munich's suburbs. It is striking that, in the early years of the NSDAP, the German-Austrian Hitler mixed with so many ethnic Germans who had grown up abroad, intermingling with German-Americans, Swiss Germans, German-Russians, and even a German-Egyptian. He was admired by many people from humble backgrounds in Munich who felt that they had been the victims of social or economic change, by Protestants living in the city, by Catholics who wanted to break with their church's internationalism, and by young, idealistic students. The Bavarian establishment, meanwhile, saw in him nothing but a talented tool that they hoped they could use to change the constitutional arrangements in Bavaria's favor. They did not anticipate that Hitler might turn the tables on them. Hitler much preferred the company of his newly adopted family over that of his real one. Thus, in late April 1923, he was less than excited about the imminent visit of his sister Paula to Munich. Even though she left Austria for the first time in her life to see him, he did everything he could to minimize the time he would have to spend with her. Conveniently, there was no space in his room on Tirschenstrasse to put her up. So he asked Maria Hertreiter, whom he had known ever since the 50-year-old owner of a stationery shop had joined the party not long after himself, whether Paula could stay with her while in Munich. Even though Hitler did not care much about his sister's visit, he realized Paula's visit would provide a perfect cover for him to visit Dietrich Eckart, who was in hiding in the Bavarian Alps. The escape of his paternal mentor to the mountains had been necessitated by the publication of a slanderous poem about Friedrich Ebert, the German president. It had earned Eckart an arrest warrant from the German Supreme Court, the Leipzig-based Staatsgesellschaft für das Deutsche Reich. Since his escape from Munich, Eckart had been in hiding high in the mountains close to Berchtesgaden, on the German-Austrian border, a few miles to the south of Salzburg, under a false name, Dr. Hoffmann. Hitler thus suggested to his sister, who did not know about his ulterior motive, that they take a trip to the mountains. When the siblings headed south toward the Alps on April 23, 1923, in the red convertible that Hitler owned by then, Herthreiter, whose job was to chaperone Paula, and Christian Weber, as Hitler's aide and driver, were with them. Once in Berchtesgaden, the two men left the women to explore and enjoy the resort, telling them that they had a meeting to attend in the mountains and would be back in a matter of days. Hitler and Weber then headed up the mountain. As the former recalled in 1942, he complained to Weber about what a hike it was. "Do you think I will climb up the Himalayas, that I have suddenly turned into a mountain goat?" But they soon came to the little village of Obersalzberg, a hamlet of farms, inns, and the summer homes of the well-to-do. They walked toward the Pension Moritz, where Eckart was staying under his false name. Hitler knocked on the door of Eckart's room, calling out for Didi. Eckart answered the door in his nightgown, excited at the sight of his friend and protégé. Hitler's visit to Eckart in the mountains high above Berchtesgaden, which lasted a few days, was his introduction to the Obersalzberg, which would become his alpine retreat, a favorite place to which he would withdraw while in power before making big decisions. Subsequently, he would say, "It was really through Dietrich Eckart that I ended up there." Hitler's trip to see Eckart, as well as his visits with the Hunstengels, also gives testimony as to who really mattered in his life. Not his real family, but the man whom he considered a father figure and the German girl from New York, whereas when he had the opportunity to spend time with his sister, he abandoned her. And to add insult to injury, he used Paula to be able to see the person with whom he really wanted to spend time, Dietrich Eckart. By that time, Hitler felt as close to Eckart as he ever had, and yet their relationship was undergoing a major transformation. Hitler had recently replaced Eckart with Alfred Rosenberg as editor-in-chief of the Völkischer Beobachter, which resulted in Rosenberg's becoming the chief ideologue of the NSDAP. Eckart's demotion was the consequence, first and foremost, of Hitler's realization that Eckart simply was not up to the task of running a day-to-day business. In 1941, Hitler would say, "Never would I have given him a big newspaper to run. One day it would have been published, the next day it wouldn't." Yet Hitler would still talk of him with admiration, and add that as far as running a big newspaper went, I would not be able to do it either. I have been fortunate that I got a few people who know how to do it. Dietrich Eckart could not have run the Reichskulturkammer, Reich Chamber of Culture, either, but his accomplishments are everlasting. It would be as if I tried to run a farm. I wouldn't be able to do it. However, tensions did emerge between Hitler and Eckart during one of Hitler's subsequent visits to the mountains that summer, as each thought the other had made a fool of himself over a woman. According to Eckart, Hitler was embarrassing himself in failing to conceal how much he fancied the 6-foot-tall, blonde wife of the innkeeper. In her presence, his cheeks turned red, his breath was short, and his eyes sparkled, while he walked about nervously or showed off around her like a pubescent boy. Clearly annoyed with Eckart's disapproval, Hitler sneered in turn behind Eckart's back that Eckart had become an old pessimist and a senile weakling who has fallen in love with this girl, Annerl, who is 30 years younger than him. Hitler was also very annoyed that Eckart disapproved that he was presenting himself politically as a messiah and had compared himself to Jesus Christ, and was furious that Eckart doubted a successful Bavarian putsch could turn into a successful national revolution. Eckart stated, "Suppose we even succeed in taking Munich by a putsch. Munich is not Berlin. It would lead to nothing but ultimate failure." Hitler's response was, "You speak of the lack of support. That is no reason to hesitate, When the hour is ripe, let us march. Then supporters will find themselves. Due to Eckart's unreliability in operational matters, and no doubt out of temporary annoyance with him, Hitler began trying to run the party without his direct help. For instance, he turned to the Berlin coffee merchant Richard Frank in the hope that Frank might help him improve on his dismal fundraising record in Munich. The Berlin businessman put him in touch with Alfred Kuhlo, the head of the Bavarian Federation of Industrialists. Yet Hitler failed to find common ground with the industrialists Kuhlo arranged for him to meet, due to the anti-Freemasonry and anti-Semitic stands of the NSDAP. On hearing their conditions for a low-interest loan, Hitler responded, "Keep your money," and left the room. As he recalled in 1942, "I had no idea that they were all Freemasons. How often did I subsequently have to hear people tell me, 'Well, if only you'll cut all the anti-Jewish agitation out.'" Having failed to secure the necessary funds in Munich, Hitler tried once more to make use of Eckart as a political operator, while the two men and their peers continued to live in anticipation of a political crisis that they could exploit, to bring about a Mussolini-style takeover of Bavaria and Germany. Hitler and Emil Ganser thus took Eckart along on a trip to Zurich in August 1923, in the hope that the Wille family might help the party again, and in the belief that Eckart's presence would make a difference in this endeavor. Even though Jule Wille assembled a few dozen Swiss businessmen, members of the German colony, as well as right-wing Swiss officers to meet the leader of the NSDAP at Via Schönberg on August 30th, Hitler's address to his Swiss audience and his meeting the following day with Wille's parents were both fiascos. Hitler, Eckart, and Ganser had to return to Bavaria empty-handed. In all likelihood, Hitler's mission to Switzerland had failed because of insufficient common political ground between him and the associates of his Swiss host. However, Hitler and Ganser blamed Eckart's late-night behavior and lack of social graces. As Ganser put it, "The people here would almost have been won over to the new idea if Dietrich Eckart hadn't had 1/8 in the early hours and hadn't hammered with his fist onto the table and acted like an elephant in a china store. These Bavarian methods are out of place here." The Switzerland debacle reinforced Hitler's belief that, as a political operator, Eckart had become a liability. Yet he did not treat him in the same way he had those who stood in his way. Harrer had been discarded. Drexler had been sidelined while continuing to be treated with superficial politeness. Eckart, meanwhile, was merely removed from operational matters by necessity, due to his drinking habits as well as his disorganization. Nevertheless, emotionally and intellectually, Hitler stayed close to Eckart, despite their quarrel in the summer, and continued to visit him in the mountains that year. Furthermore, the way Hitler would speak about Eckart during the Second World War reveals that their relationship had not been just of a political nature. It also had had an emotional connection that had never been the case between Hitler and his sister. For instance, during the night of January 16-17, 1942, Hitler would reminisce, "Things were so pleasant at Dietrich Eckart's place when I visited him on Franz Josef Strasse." The political crisis in Germany had taken a sharp turn for the worse since Eckart wrote in the guest book of the Schwarzenbachs in December 1922 that the year of decision had come. In January, French and Belgian troops occupied the Ruhr district, Germany's industrial heartland, out of concern that Germany would stop making its reparation payments. The move totally backfired, as the foreign occupation of the district stiffened German resolve to defy the French and the Belgians. What ensued were civil war-like conditions lasting for several months. The German government, all the while, printed more and more money to meet its reparation payments and try to fix the domestic economy, thus inadvertently producing hyperinflation. By the summer, the German economy and its currency were in freefall. In plotting how best to benefit both personally and for his party from the worsening political crisis, Hitler turned less and less toward other people for advice in operational and tactical matters, relying increasingly on his gut instinct as well as his study of history. While continuing to eschew a style of politics predicated on the art of compromise and deal-making, he was perfectly happy to make insincere tactical compromises. In other words, he was willing to do and say whatever it took to pursue his political goals. A compromise for him was never genuine, but always a means to an end. Due to his Manichean worldview, his extremist personality, and the nature of his political end goals, Hitler, unlike other politicians, was never content with standing by compromises. His ultimate aim was a total transformation of Germany. As he deemed that transformation to be a life-or-death issue, any compromise could be only of a tactical and temporary nature for him. Tactically, Hitler had an astonishing talent for presenting himself in a way that would make people holding opposing political views believe that he supported them. For instance, monarchists thought that deep in his heart he was a monarchist, whereas Republicans thought he really was Republican by conviction. The fact that the surviving books from Hitler's private library include a heavily annotated copy of a book on socialist monarchy as the state of the future would suggest that he genuinely was trying to figure out what future role, if any, monarchies should have. However, he did not publicly voice his opinion on the question, but, as Hermann Hesse recalled, remained vague about his preferences. He thus allowed monarchists to believe he would help them bring back the monarchy, while others thought he would aid them in establishing a socialist and nationalist state. For instance, Hitler had stated in a speech on April 27, 1920, "The choice now is not one between a monarchy and a republic, but we shall only go for the form of state, which in any given situation is the best for the people." Hitler's odd mixture of bold and vague statements, both in the early 1920s and subsequently, always would leave open the question as to what was a genuine versus a tactical statement on his part. This would allow people to project their own ideas onto him. Hitler managed to make himself a canvas upon which everyone could draw his or her own image of him. As a result, people of disparate ideas and convictions would support him, even though their images of him varied widely. This, in turn, would allow him to rise in the years to come. Once in power, it would provide a smokescreen behind which he could pursue goals that were often different in character from those that people thought they were supporting by backing him. In short, he managed to present himself in a way that ensured that everybody had their own Hitler, thus empowering him to pursue his own policy goals, which, for instance, allowed both monarchists and their adversaries to view Hitler as one of their own. It was of the utmost importance for Hitler in 1923 not to antagonize monarchists. The NSDAP was far too small on its own to be anything but the organizational shell or structure of a protest movement. Furthermore, the party had to rely on the goodwill of Bavarian monarchists and others in the political establishment to avoid being banned, as it already had been recently in Prussia and Hesse. If his party wanted to exploit the rapidly deteriorating political situation in Germany and head a national revolution, Hitler had to try, for a while, to piggyback the NSDAP upon a much stronger political movement. Subsequently, he would need to play the leaders of that movement against one another and, by doing so, overwhelm and eliminate them, in the same way that he had managed to remove Harrer and Drexler from the leadership of his own party. The obvious choice for Hitler was to ride to power on the backs of Bavarian and Prussian conservatives. Joining forces with monarchists, who were hardcore Bavarian separatists and opponents of a united Germany, was, of course, anathema to him. But collaborating with conservatives who dreamed of the re-establishment of a Bavarian monarchy that would remain within the fold of a more nationalist Germany was tactically acceptable. As Esse recalled, Hitler did not challenge them, for the simple reason that he wanted to get the support of the patriotic leagues operating in Bavaria. Those leagues were de facto covert paramilitary organizations meant to circumvent both the terms of the Versailles Treaty and the dissolution of a separate Bavarian army created in the wake of the post-war revolution in Bavaria. Gaining the support of Bavarian and North German conservatives would be a monumental challenge, not least because the Bavarian establishment was deeply divided in their attitudes toward the NSDAP. To win over the political establishment of Bavaria as collaborators, Hitler would thus have to present himself as someone who, out of patriotic duty, would do their bidding for them. As the overwhelming majority of members of the Bavarian establishment still had at least monarchist sympathies, Hitler had to go out of his way not to appear as an opponent of the monarchy. As far as they were concerned, the future of the Bavarian monarchy still hung in the air. Even though Ludwig III had died in late 1921, it was expected that his son, Ruprecht von Bayern, would eventually proclaim himself king once the political circumstances were right, as Ludwig technically had never abdicated. What helped Hitler was that an increasing number of men in the Bavarian political establishment, including many of those who had not given up on democracy, mistakenly thought that they could use the leader of the NSDAP as a pawn in their own game. For instance, Count Hugo von Lerchenfeld, who had replaced Gustav von Kahr as Bavarian minister-president in September 1921, firmly supported parliamentary democracy. In fact, Count Lerchenfeld had been willing to form a coalition government of the Bavarian People's Party, BVP, and the Social Democratic Party, SPD. The eventual failure to form an alliance was not due to any insurmountable disagreement over democracy. Rather, as far as the BVP was concerned, it had been a result of the SPD's unwillingness to accept that sovereignty should lie, first and foremost, with Bavaria. When, a year later, Lerchenfeld's government had collapsed, a more conservative government had been formed under yet another technocrat, Eugen Ritter von Nilling. Nevertheless, the primary preoccupation of Nilling's government had been to bring power back to Bavaria, not to abolish democracy, and for that the government was prepared to make use of Hitler, if need be. As the visit of an American diplomat to Munich in November 1922 revealed, Bavarian politicians and technocrats then believed Hitler to be nothing but a useful pawn in their game. Captain Truman Smith, the assistant military attaché of the U.S. Embassy in Berlin, was told during his exploratory trip to Munich to gain a first-hand impression of this man, Hitler, yet the goal of the Bavarian political establishment was not to abolish the Constitution. Rather, it was to revise the Weimar Constitution so as to give the Bavarian state more independence, and so as to return Germany to the kind of federal system that had existed prior to the war. The officials whom Truman Smith met explained that the Bavarian establishment essentially had very different ideals and goals from those of the National Socialists, and that supporting Hitler was therefore no more than a means to an end. Furthermore, officials in the Bavarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs informed Smith that although the National Socialists were hostile to the Bavarian government, some of their goals could be channeled to the advantage of the Bavarian establishment. Smith was also told that the National Socialists could be used to pull workers away from the extreme left and thus to contain it. Smith, who while in Munich attended a National Socialist rally at which Hitler had shouted amid frantic cheering, "Death to the Jews," was also told that Hitler was not as radical as his speeches made him out. One of the Bavarian Foreign Ministry officials with whom the attaché met was of the opinion that, behind the scenes, the National Socialists are reasonable persons who bark louder than they bite. Max Erwin von Schubner-Richter, meanwhile, informed Smith that Hitler had reached a secret compromise with the Bavarian government, regarding what the party could and couldn't do within Bavaria. As the information provided to Smith reveals, Hitler's deceit had worked astonishingly well for a while. Yet he still faced two major challenges. He still needed to demonstrate that he could play the members of the Bavarian establishment against one another, and thereby overwhelm them just as easily as he had managed to trick them into believing that they were, in fact, playing him. Moreover, he had to deal with the important and powerful minority of establishment figures whom he had not managed to fool into believing that he was their pawn. For instance, Bavaria's Minister of the Interior, Franz Xaver Schweier, had consistently seen in Hitler a grave and uncontrollable danger. As early as the spring of 1922, Schweier had contemplated taking decisive action against the leader of the NSDAP. On March 17, 1922, Schweier had invited the leaders of the BVP, the conservative Mittelpartei, the liberal German Democratic Party, the Independent Social Democrats, and the Social Democrats to a meeting to discuss Hitler. At the gathering, Schweier complained in his Swabian patois about the banditry of Hitler's supporters in the streets of Munich. Hitler, he said, behaved as if he was the master of the Bavarian capital, while in fact he was a stateless individual. Schweier then shared the news with the assembled party leaders that he was considering expelling Hitler from Bavaria. At a time when Helena Hamstegel, the German girl from New York, was more likely to support him than were members of Munich's indigenous establishment, Schweier's move posed a grave threat to Hitler. He faced the acute risk that his political career would collapse like a house of cards. Chapter 12. Hitler's First Book. Summer to Autumn, 1923. Eventually, Hitler got wind of Interior Minister Franz Xaver Schweier's plans to throw him out of the country. The threat of imminent arrest and deportation so worried him that he did not return home to his room on Tirschenstrasse for a few days, hiding in the apartment of his bodyguard, Ulrich Graf. In the end, though, Hitler was spared from being sent back to Austria due to support he received from an unexpected side: the leader of the Social Democrats, Erhard Auer. Hitler's liberal political rival shot Schweier's proposal down, arguing that expelling the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, from Bavaria would be undemocratic, and that ultimately Hitler was too insignificant a figure anyway to pose a danger. Ironically, Hitler's attempt to plot himself to power would be given another lifeline soon, thanks to the Social Democrats' tragic miscalculation of him, rather than by support of the Cell of Order set up by the BVP and its allies in 1920. In the face of adversity, Hitler did not give up. Rather than keep his head down, he intensified his efforts to emerge on top from the deepening political crisis. Over the summer and autumn of 1923, he would look for ways to hone his craft even more effectively than previously had been the case. He would take stock of where he currently stood and conclude that he had to change his tactics radically so that he, rather than somebody else, would head a national revolution once the time was ripe. It is revealing that his ambition and megalomania had grown so far by 1923 that after narrowly escaping deportation as a stateless political activist, he nevertheless believed that it was he who could and should lead a national and nationalist revolutionary movement. It is also telling that, by then, his political talents had developed sufficiently to enable him to assess self-critically what had gone wrong and had brought him to the verge of deportation, and thus learn from his operational and tactical mistakes. One source of inspiration on how to move forward was an article that appeared in the September 1st edition of Heimatland, the newspaper of the Einwohnerwellen, People's Militias, of Munich. The article encouraged its readers to take inspiration not just from Italy, but also from Turkey about how to stage a successful nationalist coup. Written by Hans Troobst, a 31-year-old officer who had spent the previous 12 years in the military, first in the regular army, then in Freikorps, and most recently in the Kemalist forces during the Turkish War of Independence. It laid out the lessons for Germany from Turkey's response to the Treaty of Sèvres. Turkey, like Germany, had been on the losing side of the First World War, and in the summer of 1919 had been forced to sign the treaty in Sèvres, on the outskirts of Paris, which was just as punitive as the one that Germany had to sign at around the same time in Versailles. But, unlike the German government, the Turkish Kemalist leadership had subsequently refused to implement the treaty. As the editors of Heimatland argued in their editorial endorsement of Tropst's article, Germany should take a leaf out of the Kemalist response to the post-First World War settlement. The fate of Turkey is strikingly similar to our own. From Turkey we can learn how we could have done things better. If we want to become free, we will have no choice but to imitate in one way or another the example of Turkey. Tropst had returned to Germany early the previous month. Rather than heading back home to his native Weimar in central Germany, he had made his way to Munich to stay with his brother for a while. In the Bavarian capital, he had met up with General Erich Ludendorff, who by then coordinated many of the ultra-nationalist activities in the city. With Ludendorff, he devised to write a series of 6 articles for Heimatland that would set out Turkish lessons for Germany. The ideas put forward in the September 1st article clearly resonated with the ideas Hitler himself had expressed in a speech in November 1922, when he had talked about the examples both Ataturk and Mussolini had set for Germany. When Hitler read the piece, he became very eager to meet Tropst. Fritz Laubuck, Hitler's secretary and son of the founder of the first NSDAP chapter outside Munich, therefore wrote to Tropst on September 7, 1923, telling him, "One day we will also have to do what you have experienced in Turkey, in order to become free," and that Hitler wanted to meet Tropst the following week for an hour in the offices of the Völkischer Beobachter on Schellingstrasse. Hitler did not wish to have just a general chat with Tropst. He hoped to get detailed and actionable ideas on how to stage a successful coup, which explains why he wanted the SA, Sturmabteilung, leaders to be present at the meeting. Laubuck had stressed in the letter to Tropst how important Hitler deemed it to talk directly with a participant in the events in Turkey. To Tropst's great disappointment, the proposed gathering did not take place in the end, as Tropst had already left Munich for North Germany by the time Laubuck sent the letter. Even though the meeting between Tropst and Hitler did not materialize, Tropst's articles are highly significant. Not only do they reveal some of Hitler's sources of inspiration during the autumn of 1923, as he tried to figure out how best to plot himself to power, they are also of the utmost importance in shedding light on the genesis of the Holocaust. As another of Tropst's articles, published on October 15, 1923, laid out lessons for a national purification of Germany along Turkish lines, based on the Armenian genocide of 1915. Hand in hand with the establishment of a united front must be national purification. In this respect, the circumstances were the same in Asia Minor as here. The bloodsuckers and parasites on the Turkish national body were Greeks and Armenians. They had to be eradicated and rendered harmless. Otherwise, the whole struggle for freedom would have been put in jeopardy. Gentle measures, that history has always shown, will not do in such cases, and considerations for the so-called long-established or decent elements, or whatever these catchwords may be, would be fundamentally wrong, because the result would be compromise, and compromise is the beginning of the end. Almost all of those of foreign background, Fremdstämmige, in the area of combat had to die. Their number is not put too low, with 500,000. The Turks have provided the proof that the purification of a nation of its foreign elements on a grand scale is possible. It would not be really a nation if it were unable to deal with the momentary economic difficulties resulting from this mass expulsion. Curiously, even though in this article Tropst laid out a plan for how Germany could get rid of its own bloodsuckers and parasites, which everybody would have understood to refer to Germany's Jews, Hitler did not publicly take up his thinly veiled suggestion that the Jews of Germany should meet the same fate as the Armenians in the First World War. In fact, the only known time that Hitler previously had mentioned the Armenians during a conversation with one of his financial backers, Eduard August Scharrer, in late December 1922, he had not been prophesying at all that the Jews would meet the fate of the Armenians, even though the reference had come in the context of a threat he had made against the Jews. On the contrary, Hitler had compared Germany's fate with that of the Armenians, arguing that Jews were increasingly gaining control over Germany. According to Hitler, Germany would go the way of the Armenians and become a defenseless nation in decline unless the Germans defended themselves against the Jews. The Jewish question needs to be solved in the manner of Frederick the Great, who made use of the Jews where he might profit from them and removed them where they might be harmful. There will have to be a solution to the Jewish question. It would be best for both sides if it were to be a solution governed by reason. Failing that, there will be only two alternatives. Either the German people will come to resemble a people like the Armenians or the Levantines, or there will be a bloody conflict. Only in 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, when Hitler was trying to figure out how to clear people from the territory in the East he was intending to conquer, would he pick up Tropp's Armenian proposal from 1923. On August 22, 1939, when the leaders of the armed forces, totaling approximately 50 generals and other high-ranking officers, would be summoned to his Alpine retreat to be told Hitler's imminent plans for war, he would refer to the fate of the Armenians during the First World War. And so, for the present, only in the East I have put my death head formations in place, with the command relentlessly and without compassion to send into death many women and children of Polish origin and language. Only thus we can gain the living space we need. Who, after all, is today speaking about the destruction of the Armenians? Poland will be depopulated and settled with Germans. My pact with the Poles was merely conceived of as a gaining of time. As for the rest, gentlemen, the fate of Russia will be exactly the same as I am now going through with in the case of Poland. After Stalin's death, he is a very sick man, we will break the Soviet Union. Then there will begin the dawn of German rule of the earth. Hitler's point in 1939 was that Germany would be able to get away with treating the populations living in territories earmarked for German colonization in the same way the Ottomans had treated the Armenians during the First World War. In other words, when raising the question of who, after all, is today speaking about the destruction of the Armenians, he argued that even if there were a public outcry over German conduct in the East, it would blow over. Hitler's failure publicly to take up Tropp's suggestion could be read as revealing that, in 1923, there was no apparent concern or desire on Hitler's part to define the end game for the minorities he was targeting, or at least a genocidal solution was not yet high on his agenda. Indeed, the statement made toward Scharrer would suggest that despite his allusion to a bloody conflict, his preference was for a solution governed by reason, along the lines of the anti-Jewish policies of Frederick the Great. Even a reference that Hitler would make to the gassing of Jews toward the end of Mein Kampf does not demonstrate in and of itself genocidal intent. He would state, if, at the beginning of the war and during the war, 12 or 15,000 of these Hebraic corruptors of the nation had been subjected to poison gas such as had to be endured in the field by hundreds of thousands of our very best German workers of all classes and professions, then the sacrifice of millions at the front would not have been in vain. Here he is speaking about something quite different from the extermination of the Jews of Europe during the Holocaust through gassing. Rather, he suggested that the Jews of Germany could be terrorized into submission, rather than be killed, by exposing several thousand of them to mustard gas. However, as a letter Uwe Wille had sent to Rudolf Hess the previous year indicates, Hitler and Hess clearly had already, at the very least, toyed with the possibility of a genocidal anti-Jewish solution by the time Trost published his article about the Armenian lessons for Germany. On November 13, 1922, during Hesse's study abroad semester in Zurich, Wille, who at the beginning of the First World War had expressed his equal admiration for German Jews and for German militarism, had written to him that he found the anti-Semitism of the NSDAP pointless and counterproductive. Believing you can exterminate Ausrotten Marxism and the Jews with machine guns is a fatal mistake, he added. They are not the cause of the public's lack of national pride. On the contrary, Marxism and the Jews have been able to win such scandalous influence among the German people precisely because the German people already lack sufficient national pride. The letter is more interesting for what Wille was responding to than for his own attitudes toward Jews. Clearly, he would not have told Hess that trying to exterminate the Jews with machine guns was a mistake, had not Hess previously told Wille that the National Socialists were contemplating the idea. Thus, Hitler's not publicly engaging Tropst's suggestion should not be taken as proof that he did not feel inspired by it, particularly since his statements to his generals from August 22, 1939, would closely resemble some of the ideas expressed by Trost. In fact, as became apparent in an interview Hitler gave a Catalonian journalist later in 1923, his preferred final anti-Jewish solution was already genocidal by 1923. However, his primary goal that year was to figure out how to stage a successful coup, which is why Tropst's first article had had the most immediate impact on him. As Hitler walked the streets of Munich with his Alsatian, Wolf, whip in hand and wearing a long black coat and black slouch hat, as he spent time in his favorite café, Café Heck on Hofgarten, as he attended the weekly gathering of the inner circle of the NSDAP leadership at Café Neumar, an old-fashioned café on the Victualian Market, or as he was treated to coffee, cake, and the latest gossip from across town at the stationery store of Quirin Deitzel and his wife, two admirers of his, he analyzed how to change his tactics so as to hasten the advent of a national revolution and emerge as its leader. At the stationery store of Quirin Deitzel and his wife, two admirers of his, he analyzed how to change his tactics so as to hasten the advent of a national revolution and emerge as its leader. One of his challenges was that a lot of the people in Munich who were generally positively predisposed to his political ideas expressed doubts that Hitler was really the right man to lead them. For instance, Gottfried Feder, the senior figure in the party who had introduced him to the alleged ills of interest slavery, thought the party's political chances were undermined by Hitler's work habits. On August 10, 1923, Feder wrote to Hitler, "I really have to tell you that I find the anarchy in your time management most detrimental for the entire movement. Furthermore, some of the people Hans Tropst had encountered in Munich over the summer had wondered whether there was anything to Hitler other than empty words not backed up by action. For instance, that summer, Tropst had overheard his brother's maids say, 'When will Hitler at last get things started? He must also have received money from the Jews, if he always is nothing but words.' Publisher Julius Friedrich Lehmann's wife, too, had her doubts. As she wrote in her diary in early October, 'Now more than ever we are waiting for a savior.' Here, in Munich, many deem Hitler, the leader of the National Socialists, to be that man. I know him too little and for the time being do not hold him in high esteem." As that diary entry implies, the biggest obstacle Hitler had to overcome was not the existence of doubts toward him among some of the people who knew him well. Rather, it was that Hitler was still far too little known. This, he believed, was the single biggest factor holding him back. If even the wife of one of his most loyal backers in Munich thought she did not really know him, the head of the NSDAP, He could not hope to become Germany's savior. If Hitler did not just want to preach to the converted in Munich, he had to change his tactics dramatically. He urgently needed to boost his image among conservatives and populists on the right all over Bavaria and all over Germany to enable himself ultimately to become their Mussolini. So far, Hitler's life had largely remained an enigma. Unless he was forced to, he never had publicly spoken about himself. With the exception of a brief reference to his entry into the party in a speech he had given on January 29, 1923, he had not given away anything about his life in his speeches. Only in a small number of private letters, in police and court statements, and in 2 articles for the Völkischer Beobachter, in response to what he perceived as a libelous statement about him made elsewhere, did he offer details about his life. For the time being, most people did not even know what Hitler looked like, as no photo of him had ever been published. Indeed, he had enforced a Bilderverbot, a prohibition against taking photos of him and circulating them. Even most of the attendees of his talks had only seen him from the distance. In May 1923, the German satirical magazine Simplicissimus even had poked fun at this, publishing a series of silly drawings and cartoons imagining Hitler's appearance. See Image 19. If we can believe Konrad Haydn, who first encountered Hitler when Haydn was head of a group of democratic pro-republic university students who opposed the NSDAP, and then as a journalist, Hitler was afraid of being recognized and assassinated, and thus refused to be photographed. As a result, even in the spring and summer of 1923, Hitler could still intermingle with people in Munich and southern Bavaria without being recognized. During the Second World War, he would recall how amusing it had been for him during his visits to Dietrich Eckart in the mountains to listen in to the debates that people were having over meals about Hitler. No pictures of me existed. Unless you knew me personally, you would not know what I looked like. The days in which nobody recognized me were, for me, the most beautiful time. How much I liked going elsewhere in the Reich at that time. Everyone believed me to be someone different. Just not Hitler. Hitler's strategy to create a public image of himself without using any photos had worked well as long as he had operated solely in Munich and its environs. Although he had choreographed his events prior to 1923 and pursued his style of politics with the help of visual imagery, he had had to rely on his followers to tell their friends and acquaintances about the spectacle of his speeches and hope that next time they, too, would want to experience him. Indeed, people had come to attend his speeches because they were curious about his voice rather than his face. This approach had allowed Hitler to turn from a nobody into a local celebrity, but it would not suffice to turn him into a Bavarian Mussolini. During the summer of 1923, he had a sudden change of heart. He seems to have realized that if no one knew what he looked like, he could not be the face, or at least a face, of the national revolution that he deemed to be imminent. He hence went from one extreme to the other, commissioning Heinrich Hoffmann to take photos of him and then having thousands of picture postcards of himself printed, as a result of which photos of Hitler appeared all over Munich by the autumn of 1923. See Images 22 and 23. Hitler and his party now were trying to portray Hitler as the young and energetic face, the future, standing next to General Ludendorff, who many people on the radical right all over Germany hoped would head a national revolution. For the next 20 years, until Hitler would suddenly reinstate a Bilderverbot in 1943, Hoffmann and his fellow propagandists would carefully stage photographs and film footage of him that would turn him into an icon. The resulting iconography has been so powerful that it dominates our image of Hitler to the present day. Hitler's radical recasting of his public image in anticipation of an imminent national revolution went much further than the reversal of his previous Bilderverbot. In an attempt to boost his standing among conservatives in the rest of the country, he decided to publish a selection of his speeches in book form, the collection of speeches purged of negative references to the United States that was aimed at pitching himself toward a conservative readership. Hitler also decided to write a biographical sketch of his life to precede his speeches in the book, to sell the idea that he was Germany's savior in waiting. After writing the 9-page sketch, he gave it to his close associate Josef Stolzing-Czerny, an Austrian-born journalist and National Socialist who would also help Hitler bring Mein Kampf into shape for copy editing. The sketch, which constitutes the first published Hitler biography, tells the life of Adolf Hitler from his years in Vienna to 1923. It narrates how his experiences as a manual worker in Vienna provided him with revelations about the nature of politics and about how Germany could be saved. It claims that Hitler had fully developed all his major ideas by the time he was 20. As the book was aimed at a conservative readership, it sought to demonstrate how Hitler's experiences had taught him that workers and the bourgeoisie needed to be brought together under one roof. For him, they were all workers. Some used their hands, others their head. The sketch also makes the case that all Germans, both inside and outside the country's current borders, should be brought together under one roof. It celebrates the idealism and sacrifice of Germans as the antithesis of the activities of international Jewish mammonism. And it makes the promise to Germans, both figuratively and literally, to bring back the colors of the pre-war German Reich, black, white, and red. We will give the German people the old colors back in a new form. The biographical sketch also tells the story of how Hitler had been an unusually brave soldier on the Western Front, and yet in his sentiments had been the personification of Germany's unknown soldier. Well in line with what Hitler would write in Mein Kampf, it presents his time at Pasewalk at the end of the war as the moment that transformed him into a leader, and tells the story of his purported attempted arrest by Red Guardists, as well as his task as an education officer in 1919. Next, it falsely presents Hitler as one of the 7 founders of the NSDAP. It culminates in an account of the growth of the movement between 1919 and 1923, arguing that deliverance for Germany was nigh, as Hitler would be the nation's savior. As writing a self-laudatory biographical sketch himself would hardly go over well with traditional conservatives, Hitler decided that it would be more appropriate to find a conservative writer, one without any prior involvement with National Socialism, who would agree to lend his name to the sketch and claim to be the compiler and commentator of the speeches. In other words, Hitler wrote an autobiography but sought to publish it as a biography under somebody else's name, so as to boost his profile in anticipation of a national revolution. Finding a conservative writer willing to pretend to be the author of the first ever published Hitler biography would come with a double payoff. Hitler's shameless act of self-promotion would be concealed, while the impression would be created that he already was in receipt of widespread support among traditional conservatives. Since, with the facilitation of Erwin von Schubner-Richter, Hitler and Erich Ludendorff had been liaising ever more frequently about the need to trigger a national revolution, Hitler turned to the retired general for help in finding a pretend author for his book. Ludendorff was happy to oblige, and put Hitler in touch with a young man whom he knew well, Victor von Körber. The blue-eyed and blond young aristocrat fit the bill perfectly. Körber was a military hero and writer who felt attracted by the promise of a new conservatism that would bridge old-style conservatism with National Socialism. 2 years younger than Hitler, he hailed from an aristocratic Protestant family based in West Prussia, one of the heartlands of German conservatism. He had been raised on the island of Rügen in the Baltic Sea, where his father had served as a district governor, and subsequently had opted for the career of a professional soldier and officer in elite units. In 1912, Körber had trained as one of the first fighter pilots in the Prussian armed forces. Yet, as his real passions had been of a literary kind, prior to the First World War he had left the armed forces and, in Saxony's capital, Dresden, had embarked on a new career as a poet, playwright, and art critic. He also had traveled widely around Europe. During the war, he had re-entered the military, first serving on the Western Front before being transferred to the headquarters of the Air Force in Berlin, where he had headed the press department. In 1917, he had been demobilized for health reasons and had returned to Dresden before moving to Munich in the spring of 1918. In the spring of 1919, he had left the city in the wake of the establishment of the Soviet Republic and joined the 2nd Marine Brigade, Wilhelmshaven, Division Lita Vorbeck, where he had been in charge of propaganda. In early May, he had been among the troops that had put an end to the Soviet Republic. It had been during that time that Körber had started to see Bolshevism as a global danger, which would continue to be his primary concern for many years to come. Even though he had left the armed forces in July 1919, he had participated in the ill-fated Kapp Putsch the following spring. All the while, Körber's anti-Semitism had intensified, as a letter he wrote to his brother in the spring of 1922 testifies. Today, racial research has advanced far enough to recognize and prove how international Jewry, through its people, has purposefully spurred the decay of the Germans. Körber had been eager to turn his anti-Semitism into a living. "I've been trying for weeks to find employment," he told his brother. "Everywhere people prefer to fire than hire. Besides, it is in and of itself very difficult to find something suitable. Propaganda work for the National Party, anti-Semitism, which is blossoming here greatly, would be suitable. But these positions are rare and lousily paid at that." Yet later in the year, his fortunes had been starting to improve. He had traveled for several months to Finland on an anti-Bolshevik mission to study how the Finns had defeated the Russians in the winter of 1918-1919 and gained national independence. After his return from Scandinavia to Bavaria's capital in mid-October 1922, he had started to work as a correspondent for 3 Finnish newspapers. However, as he had complained to his brother, things still looked dire, and not just because the Finnish newspapers for which he had been writing had been unreliable in paying him. "We are simply physically collapsing here. What is the point of all the hard work, all the status, honor, and fame? Jewry wants to destroy all intelligence and the middle class like in Russia. The people is running into its own ruin. We are working with all our might to rip the mask off Jewry." Even though he had not been paid for several of his articles, his new job had paid off politically for him. As a result of his work as a foreign correspondent, he had made contact with Ludendorff, whom he had previously met during the war, and whom he admired with youthful optimism. Just like Ulrich von Hassel, the conservative who had written a manifesto about the future of conservatism in the wake of the First World War, Körber believed that there was no going back to the conservatism of old. He held that the social question needed to be addressed, and he was of the opinion that the working and middle classes could plant the seed from which a new and rejuvenated Germany would grow. Körber thus saw in Ludendorff's evolving collaboration with Hitler the realization of the dream of a new kind of conservatism that would reinvigorate Germany. It was difficult to imagine a better conservative writer than Körber as the face of Hitler's book. After Ludendorff introduced Hitler to Körber at his house, and the deal between the two men regarding Hitler's book was sealed, the young aristocrat and the leader of the NSDAP only met twice more face-to-face. The book appeared that autumn under the title Adolf Hitler, Sein Leben, seine Reden. Adolf Hitler, His Life and His Speeches. As the book was on sale for only a few weeks before it was banned and confiscated, its impact was far more limited than Hitler had hoped and intended, even though it had had a print run of 70,000 copies. Yet the book matters less for its actual impact on conservatives across Germany than for the light it sheds on how Hitler saw himself by the autumn of 1923, and on how he tried to recast himself at the time so as to become a national right-wing leader, rather than a stateless political activist who had to live with the threat of deportation, as he had been earlier in the year. The book belies the idea, to which Hitler occasionally paid lip service, that until the writing of Mein Kampf, he saw himself only as a drummer who was doing the bidding of others and had no ambitions to lead Germany into the future. In his autobiographical sketch, he put into the mouth of Körber his own determination that he was the leader of the most radically honest national movement. Further, the autobiographical sketch described him as the architect, Baumeister, who is building the mighty German cathedral. And it urged the people to hand power over to him as the man who is ready as well as prepared to lead the German struggle for liberation. As Hitler's earlier call for a genius to become Germany's new leader indicates, it would be odd to argue that he merely wanted to play the role of drummer to some other new genius. As, according to the thinking of the time, geniuses were not established figures but people of backgrounds and life stories very much like his own, why would he have wanted to be drummer to a person like himself, rather than be that person himself? Furthermore, the very fact that in 1921 Hitler had only accepted the position of leader of the NSDAP on the condition that he was given dictatorial powers points to a man who did not want to be just a propagandist for somebody else. Hitler's 1923 book demonstrates that not only did other people see a messiah in him, but, as his spat with Dietrich Eckart over the summer had already indicated, he did so himself. His autobiographical sketch repeatedly uses biblical language, arguing that the book brought out under Körber's name should become the new Bible of today as well as the book of the German people. It also uses terms such as holy and deliverance. Most important, it directly compares Hitler to Jesus, likening the purported moment of his politicization in Passivhaus to Jesus' resurrection. This man, destined to eternal night, who during this hour endured crucifixion on pitiless Calvary, who suffered in body and soul, one of the most wretched from among this crowd of broken heroes, this man's eyes shall be opened, calm shall be restored to his convulsed features. In the ecstasy that is only granted to the dying seer, his dead eyes shall be filled with new light, new splendor, new life. Occasionally, Hitler previously had compared both himself and his party to Jesus, or described Jesus as his role model. Elsewhere, too, Hitler left no doubt that he already saw himself as Germany's savior. It would not be just in the run-up to the Second World War and during the conflict, when he would survive several assassination attempts, that Hitler would believe himself to have been protected by Providence, but he already considered himself to have been chosen by Providence in 1923, as became apparent during one of the weekends in September and October that he and Alfred Rosenberg spent with Helene Hofstengel in the summer home of the Hofstengels in Ufing am Stavlesi, a small, picturesque village in the foothills of the Alps. During those weekends, with their hostess, Rosenberg and Hitler pursued the latter's favorite pastime. In his red Mercedes, they explored the castles and villages lying in the foothills of the Alps, even though Hitler never learned to drive himself. If we can trust Helene's testimony, he told her on one occasion when his car ended up in a ditch, but they were not injured, "This will not be the only accident which will leave me unharmed. I shall come through them all and succeed in my plans." The reason that Hitler, despite seeing himself as Germany's messiah and savior, nevertheless occasionally pretended to be merely the drummer for somebody else is quite simple. He had to square the circle. On the one hand, he desired to boost his own national profile through the publication of his book and the release of photos depicting him, and thus to put himself in a position by which to head a national revolution. On the other hand, he was dependent on the support of both the conservative Bavarian political establishment and Ludendorff, as well as conservatives in the north, and he wanted to be piggybacked to power by them. In short, he was trying to make a direct pitch to Germany's conservatives and attempting to create the impression that his support among them was already larger than it really was, all while trying to avoid antagonizing their leaders. As Ludendorff, as well as other conservative leaders in Bavaria and the North, had political ambitions of their own and saw in Hitler a tool they could use for their own ends, Hitler had to pretend that he was willing to play that role throughout the summer and autumn of 1923. The several surviving letters that Ludendorff wrote to Kerber, both before and after the upcoming putsch, extensively ponder about the differences between a national and völkisch vision of Germany. The letters also discuss at length the legacy of Bismarck. Yet the leader of the NSDAP does not feature in them. By not mentioning Hitler, the letters reveal how much Ludendorff saw him as just a tool to further his own plans. Therefore, Hitler could not state openly that he saw himself as a genius and messiah, even though he had told his confidants as early as 1922 that he himself wanted to lead Germany. Publicly, he had to pay lip service to being a drummer. And yet, Hitler's unknown first book, published under Victor von Kerber's name, presented Hitler and Ludendorff as leaders of equal stature. Its biographical sketch stated that as Germany was awakening politically, General Ludendorff and Hitler would stand side by side, the two great leaders, Kampfführer, from the past and the present, a military leader, Feldherr, and a man of the people, Volksmann, leadership of an invincible kind from which the German people rightly expect a better future. This was as far as Hitler could go at the time in presenting himself as Germany's savior and messiah, because Ludendorff saw in Hitler, whom he did not take seriously, as Victor von Kerber was to recall, a popular drummer for the mass movement against communism. The way Hitler wrote and launched his first book under another writer's name, as well as many of his other actions between the joining of the DAP and the autumn of 1923, reveal a canny, knowing, and conniving political operator in the making. The Hitler that comes to the fore belies that he was a primitive, raging, and nihilistic dark elemental force. Rather, he was a man with an emerging deep understanding of how political processes, systems, and the public sphere worked. His wartime study of propaganda techniques had provided him with an appreciation of the importance of constructing politically useful and effective narratives that would help him plot his way to power. His occasional insistence merely to be the drummer for somebody else, as well as his earlier ostensible reluctance to accept becoming the leader of the NSDAP, has to be seen in the Western tradition and expectation dating back to Roman times, according to which future leaders pretend to be disinterested in power, even while spending all their time seeking to acquire it. They do so both for tactical reasons and to adhere to the popular belief that somebody pushing too hard for power is not to be trusted. Julius Caesar had famously turned down the Roman crown 3 times. William Shakespeare, who in early 20th century Germany was just as popular as in his native England, has one of Caesar's assassins say, in Julius Caesar, when being asked to confirm that, "Aye, marry was it, and he put it by thrice, every time gentler than other, and at every putting by, mind, honest neighbours shouted." The assassin makes it perfectly clear that Caesar's rejection was the opposite of what he attempted to achieve. "I saw Mark Antony offer him a crown, yet 'twas not a crown neither. 'Twas one of these coronets, and, as I told you, he put it by once, but for all that, to my thinking, he would fain have had it. Then he offered it to him again, then he put it by again, but to my thinking he was very loath to lay his fingers off it. And then he offered it the 3rd time. He put it the 3rd time by, and still as he refused it, the rabblement shouted and clapped their chopped hands, and threw up their sweaty nightcaps, and uttered such a deal of stinking breath because Caesar refused the crown, that it had almost choked Caesar. For he swounded and fell down at it, and for mine own part I durst not laugh for fear of opening my lips and receiving the bad air. writing an autobiography and then releasing it as a biography under somebody else's name, in combination with the speeches he gave under his own name, helped Hitler in his endeavor to create a politically useful narrative. It made the case for a new kind of leader. While not explicitly naming him as that leader, it insidiously created the public perception of a gap that only he could fill, because the call for a genius ruled out anyone with a long-established public profile. In short, Hitler, as a conniving political operator, used his 1923 book to exploit the way the German political system and the public sphere worked, so as systematically to build a place for himself. However, his emerging talents as a scheming political operator fed his megalomania, resulting in a premature grab for power. As he would soon learn the hard way, he was still a political operator in training, rather than the master that he thought he was. Victor von Körber's subsequent life, meanwhile, would run parallel to that of Karl Mayr, Hitler's erstwhile political mentor, who would become Körber's close friend. Both men had been intimately linked to, and were to some extent responsible for, Hitler's rise, yet they would both turn against him. They would both fight a losing battle in their attempt to close the Pandora's box they had opened when aiding Hitler, ending their lives in Nazi concentration camps. In 1924, Körber would start to grow disillusioned with National Socialism and ultimately broke with both Hitler and his party. As Körber would write to Crown Prince Wilhelm, the eldest son of Kaiser Wilhelm II, in 1926, with whom he was friendly, "The Hitler movement is in such dire and disgraceful straits that there can be no doubt that it is practically finished. It is a pity in many respects. It is a pity for the people whose faith has been betrayed." In the same year, the paramilitary Junge Deutscher Orden, Young German Order, of which he was not a member, would send Körber for 9 months to France to make contact with French veteran associations and sound out the possibility of a Franco-German rapprochement. In the late 1920s, he would advocate Franco-German political and economic integration as the nucleus of a unification of Europe, which he would deem as the only way for Europe to be able to be on equal footing with the United States, and thus to survive. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, he would write regularly for the Viennese daily Neues Wiener Journal, as well as for the newspapers of the liberal Jewish Ullstein publishing house, in which he would warn against Bolshevism and German collaboration with Russian Bolshevism, as well as against National Socialists, in whom he discerned Hitler Bolsheviks. For him, Bolshevism and Hitler's National Socialism would be two sides of the same coin. As early as the spring of 1931, he would deem today's Hitler movement the greatest danger that our fatherland ever had to face. The following year, he would argue that if Hitler came to power, Germany's ultimate downfall would be inevitable. From 1927 onward, until Mayer's flight to France in 1933, Mayer would visit Körber every week in Berlin. The two men who had both played such important roles in Hitler's life would sit at the round table in Körber's apartment and exchange intelligence, work on political articles together, and collaborate on initiatives aimed at bringing about a Franco-German rapprochement. After 1933, Körber would pass secrets about Hitler's plans to successive British military attachés, warning the British in 1938 that war was imminent. He would urge the British government to support the conservative German resistance movement, which, according to him, had grown due to, among other reasons, the inhuman treatment of Jews and the threat of war. Like Fritz Wiedemann, Hitler's commanding officer from the First World War, who would serve as one of his personal adjutants until 1938, when he would turn against Hitler and offer his services to the British and the Americans, Körber would advocate the restoration of the monarchy under Crown Prince Wilhelm. After Kristallnacht, Körber, who had repented of his rabid anti-Semitism, hid Jewish newspaper tycoon and publisher Hermann Ullstein in his apartment and helped him immigrate to England. Körber would be arrested the day following the failed attempt on Hitler's life of July 20th, 1944, and spend the rest of the war in a Gestapo prison and in Sachsenhausen concentration camp. At the end of the war, he would return to the island of Rügen, but ultimately flee the Soviet-occupied zone of Germany for the West, becoming the editor-in-chief of the Europäische Illustrierte, as well as the press chief of the Marshall Plan administration in the French-occupied zone of Germany. In the early 1950s, he would be involved in high-level initiatives aimed at European integration before relocating to the Côte d'Azur in 1957 and then to Lugano in Switzerland in the mid-1960s because of his wife's ill health. Disillusioned with the general cultural decay of Europe, Körber immigrated with his wife Yvonne to Johannesburg in South Africa, where he lived next door to his best friend, a British officer with a German wife, before dying in the late 1960s. Chapter 13. The Ludendorff Putsch, Autumn 1923 to Spring 1924. Hitler's dramatic and subversive push to boost his national profile in anticipation of an imminent radical political transformation of Germany had occurred only at the 11th hour, as by October 1923, concrete steps were underway to carry out a putsch around November 9th. Yet the decision to overthrow the German government was not made in Munich, in Uffing am Staffelsee, or in any other place frequented by Hitler. It was made in Moscow. On October 4th, the Politburo of the Communist Party of Russia determined that Germany was ripe for revolution. Even though the leaders of the Communist Party of Germany, KPD, were not quite as sure about that, they did not challenge Moscow. For instance, Heinrich Brandler, the leader of the KPD, had published an article in Pravda, the official organ of the Communist Party of Russia, stating, "The older leaders among us believe that it won't be difficult, but an entirely doable task to seize power." On October 12th, the Central Committee of the KPD formally approved the decision made in Moscow. It decided that on November 9th, it would proclaim that all power had passed to a new workers' and peasants' government. As the KPD was part of a coalition government in both Thuringia and Saxony, of which Brandler ran the office of Minister-President Erich Zagner, members of two German state governments now were plotting to bring the world revolution to Germany. In response to a worsening of the political and economic crisis in Saxony, the Central Committee decided on October 20th that the revolution could no longer wait until November 9th, but needed to be moved forward to the following day. The plan was that the committee would proclaim a general strike and thus trigger revolution. But the revolution was stillborn, largely due to incompetence and dilettantism. For instance, the committee's decision was not communicated to Waldemar Rocha, even though Rocha was supposed to serve as the military head of the German Revolution. Within hours, the communist leadership of Germany felt it had to abort its plan. The attempt to embark on a communist revolution in October 1923 should not be dismissed as insignificant because it lacked majority support in Germany. The success or failure of revolutions seldom depends on majority support. As events in the North German metropolis of Hamburg demonstrate, at the very least, the attempted communist revolution could have triggered civil war in Germany had it been carried out more efficiently and had communication been improved between communist groups across Germany. As the original order of October 20th, but not the subsequent message that the revolution had been called off, reached Hamburg, communist groups there occupied 13 police stations on the morning of October 22nd, setting up barricades in the district of Barmbek and manning them with 150 men. Only after 2.5 days, and only after having repeatedly been subjected to fire by policemen, sailors, and army units, which resulted in the death of 17 policemen and 24 communists, did the revolutionaries give up. The attempted revolution in Hamburg provides a taste of what would have happened if similar events had occurred simultaneously in all major German cities. Moreover, it took about 4 times longer to put down the communist coup in Hamburg than it would take to end the putsch that would take place on November 9th in Munich, the day originally earmarked for Germany's communist revolution. The communist unrest in Germany has to be seen against the background of a development that had been underway since 1921, when the entire country had gone into crisis mode. War reparations, the humiliation of the reduction of the army and navy, the loss of territories, the French occupation of the Rhineland, and of Germany's industrial heartland on the Ruhr, as well as the passive resistance that the government encouraged to combat it, and the hyperinflation reigning in Germany all brought the country to the brink. Collapse of state authority in Berlin and elsewhere ensued. By mid-October 1923, the government had taken drastic actions to bring matters under control. For instance, the old currency was replaced by a new one, the Rentenmark, to try to tamp down inflation. Yet in the short term, the introduction of a new currency made the crisis worse, as it produced a wave of bankruptcies. The events taking place in Saxony, Thuringia, Hamburg, and elsewhere, for instance, separatists in the Rhineland proclaimed a Rhenish Republic, brought the pre-existing economic, political, and social crisis to a boil, creating the conditions Bavarian sectionalists, Bavarians who put the interest of Bavaria above everything else, and National Socialists had been waiting for. Both viewed the situation as an opportunity to present themselves as saviors from communism, in case they decided to launch a coup of their own. From the perspective of the Bavarian establishment, a situation had finally emerged that provided a very real chance to change the constitutional setup of Germany in a way that would make Bavarians masters in their own home again. Hitler, meanwhile, hoped that, similar to Mussolini's march on Rome of the previous year, it would be possible to pull off a march from Munich to Berlin meant to liberate Germany. He therefore advocated embarking on such a march as a preemptive defensive move. As he told an American journalist working for the United Press news agency in October, "If Munich won't march on Berlin if the moment is right, Berlin will march on Munich." What fueled the escalating crisis further was the hyperinflation that held Germany in its grip in the autumn of 1923. It devoured savings, often literally overnight. For instance, after a friend of Helena Hofstangl was forced to sell her share of a big mortgage, she was only able to buy 6 breakfast rolls from the profit the following morning. As Heinrich Wölfflin concluded on October 25, 1923, "The immediate future will be terrible." The Swiss art historian teaching at Munich University noted, "Prices don't rise from day to day, but from hour to hour." Things went from bad to worse. On November 4th, Wölfflin reported, "A pound of beef cost 99 billion marks yesterday." What made things even worse and more volatile was the return of Gustav von Kahr to the driver's seat of Bavarian politics at the end of September. This time, the right-wing technocrat did not become minister-president again, but was appointed General State Commissioner. In other words, he held a position similar to that of a dictator in the times of the Roman Republic, as in, his powers were those of a dictator with a time limitation. Kahr's appointment by the Bavarian government had been triggered by the occupation of Germany's industrial heartland on the Ruhr by French and Belgian troops, as, in September, the German government had decided that it had no choice but to abandon support of resistance to the occupation. In response to that decision, the Bavarian government had claimed that the conditions under which it was allowed to declare a state of emergency under Article 48 of the German Constitution had been fulfilled. The Bavarian People's Party, BVP, backed government then had appointed Kahr as General State Commissioner, thus transferring to him any executive power necessary to restore order in Bavaria. In theory, the power he held was meant to be used to uphold the constitutional order in Germany's most southern state, yet that power could be used just as easily to prepare a national revolution. In the autumn of 1923, Munich was thus awash with political actors on the right who were plotting an overthrow of the political status quo. Yet it was astonishing how uncoordinated their respective plans were, and how almost everybody overestimated his own power and influence. Just as during his time as minister-president, Kahr believed that he could control Bavaria's various nationalist and conservative groups. Further, he thought that he could bring sectionalist and pan-German forces together under one umbrella. In Hitler, he saw nothing but a figure whom he could use to further his own interests. It did not cross his mind that by treating Hitler as his tool, he had opened a Pandora's box and would no longer be able to control him. Kahr would have to pay with his own life for his miscalculation. In early 1934, Hitler's henchmen would liquidate him. Hitler, meanwhile, had fooled himself by the autumn of 1923 into believing that he was more than a tactical instrument in the hands of the Bavarian establishment. He was confident that he already had enough of a national profile, and that he, together with retired General Erich Ludendorff, was sufficiently powerful to carry out a revolution in Bavaria and subsequently to spread it all across the country. But he failed to realize that it was unimaginable that Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria and his supporters would join forces with Ruprecht's nemesis, Ludendorff. Hitler did not listen to any warnings he received that the goals of the Bavarian establishment and of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, were irreconcilable. National Socialist activists in northern Bavaria, for instance, had repeatedly sent letters to party headquarters in Munich, describing how heterogeneous the region's right-wing political groups and paramilitary organizations were, and concluding that those people would be unlikely to support the NSDAP. When the former did not receive any response from Munich, one of them, Hans Dietrich, took a train to Munich. The aim of his trip was to tell Hitler that he could not rely on the support of local militias and the Bavarian police. But Dietrich's warnings went unheeded, as Hitler had convinced himself that the political right stood united behind him. Michael von Faulhaber's sermon on November 4th should have told Hitler that the Bavarian establishment was politically not on the same page as he was, for, in his sermon, Munich's archbishop criticized the persecution of Jews in Germany. When, on the urging of Wilhelm Weiss, the editor-in-chief of the right-wing weekly Heimatland, Hans Trost returned to Munich in late October to support plans that were afoot in Bund Oberland, as the Freikorps Oberland was now called, he was surprised to see how much mistrust existed between the different groups that were preparing for a putsch. As the veteran of the Turkish War of Independence must have realized, Hitler had not even liaised sufficiently yet with several of the most important potential putschists. When Trost arrived in Munich, political chaos reigned in the city. As a result of the growing hatred for the federal government among nationalist and Bavarian sectionalist circles in Munich, various hurried plans, which at times overlapped, complemented, were coordinated, competed, or openly clashed with each other, were afoot, aiming at overthrowing the status quo in Germany. There was uncertainty and disagreement, not just between the nationalist and sectionalist factions, but also within them, as to who would lead the movement that was to overthrow the political system. Likewise, they could not agree on what would follow that overthrow. They even differed in opinion as to whether the current Bavarian government was part of the problem or part of the solution to the crisis. As Trost learned soon after his arrival in Munich, Weiss had summoned him to Bavaria in the belief that, amid this chaotic competition of ideas and plans, his presence would strengthen the cards of Weiss and his co-conspirator Captain von Müller, one of the battalion commanders of Bund Oberland. Weiss and Müller briefed Trost that their plan was to overthrow the government rather than to bully it into cooperation. Trost was most excited at the prospect of the seemingly imminent takeover of Bavaria and ultimately of Germany, as well as a subsequent war with the victor powers of the First World War. He hoped that this crisis would facilitate a resurrection of his career as an officer. As Weiss and Müller told him on the afternoon of October 31st, They had planned a putsch for the night of November 6-7. The men of Bund Oberland would pretend to carry out a nighttime exercise and then occupy military installations in Munich at 3 a.m. 2 hours later, at 5 a.m. sharp, 5 arrest squadrons would apprehend simultaneously Kahr, Minister-President Jugend von Nilling, Minister of Agriculture Johannes Wulshofer, and a number of other politicians and leaders of the police, take them to the Pioneer Barracks by 5:20 a.m., demand the immediate signing of their resignation papers, and, in case of non-cooperation, execute Wulshofer in front of the eyes of everyone else 5 minutes later. Kahr would then be supposed to appoint Ernst Pöhner, Munich's former nationalist police president, as his successor, and a new government under Pöhner would be formed that very same day, to include Ludendorff and Hitler as well. A few hours after the briefing, as night fell in Munich, Weiss, Müller, and Trobst jointly visited Friedrich Weber, the political leader of Bund Oberland, and son-in-law of pan-German publisher Julius Friedrich Lehmann, to share their plan with him. Initially, the gaunt Oberland leader remained unconvinced of its merits. For one thing, Weber still did not know what to make of Hitler and his party and remained distrustful of the National Socialist leader. For another, Weber still thought that he could get Kahr on board to support the putsch and thus make the Bavarian government a part of the solution to the problem. But then things unexpectedly tilted in favor of the visitors when Adolf Hitler suddenly showed up unannounced. Trobst noticed that he looked nervous and clearly very displeased. As it turned out, the distrust between the Oberland leaders and Hitler had been mutual. Even though for months Hitler had tried to become the head of the nationalist camp in Munich and elsewhere, he clearly was well aware that his ambitions did not match the realities yet, and that he still had a reputation for nothing but empty words. Also clearly worried that the window of opportunity for a coup would not remain open much longer, he had decided that he would either have to raise the stakes or lose everything. He told Weber and his visitors, "I barely know what more to tell the people who come to our meetings. I'm pretty sick of this rubbish." Hitler's gamble to raise the stakes paid off. As it turned out, he and the Oberland leaders alike would have preferred to spring into action earlier, but each had been unsure of the other's sentiments and intentions. Once they realized that they all wanted the same thing, a removal of the existing political settlement sooner rather than later, Hitler laid out his own plan late into the evening. The distrust between Friedrich Weber and Hitler almost certainly had been fueled by the latter's reluctance to engage closely with Lehmann and other pan-Germans. The legacy of Hitler's grudge against Karl Harrer and those supporting a Thule vision for the DAP, NSDAP, had prevented earlier cooperation and hence had stood in the way of better and more realistic planning for the putsch. Only in the following year, 1924, while the two were incarcerated together, would Friedrich Weber become Hitler's friend. Trobst enjoyed finally being able to observe Hitler at close quarters, making up for September's missed meeting with him. He was excited that Hitler would join their cause. 2 days later, on Friday, November 2nd, Trobst encountered Hitler again at a meeting of Oberland leaders at the office of Captain von Müller, who owned a small film company in Munich. Hitler urged them to act without further delay because, as Trobst recounted 3 months later, he himself, as in Hitler, had hardly any strength left. His people were about to collapse, and his party's finances were almost exhausted. By early November, Hitler was driven in equal measure by megalomania and desperation. Trobst, meanwhile, could not help but feel that Hitler was being motivated somewhat by personal interests, because all at once he declared, "You needn't think that I will just get up and leave. Something is going to happen first." As so often before and subsequently, Hitler presented a situation he faced as an all-or-nothing proposition and urged the conspirators not to hedge their bets, but to put all their money on exploiting the moment. And even now, Hitler's old fear of again being a nobody who had nowhere to go shone through in his statements made that evening in Müller's office. Trost realized that Hitler was trying to manipulate him, but he did not mind at all, as the plan of the leader of the NSDAP fed perfectly into our own plan, which was refined during the course of the day. That is, Trost and his co-conspirators did not see Hitler as their leader, but instead as a perfect means to further their own goals. Trost was particularly impressed by Hitler's talent for oratory. It was a delight to listen to him. He recounted 3 months later. Images and similes just came to him, and I suddenly understood what Ludendorff meant when he said that in Hitler we had Germany's most brilliant and most successful agitator. His image of the drunken fly really was brilliant. An intoxicated fly that lies on its back and flounders about and cannot get up again. That fly was the imperial government in Berlin. Hitler still did not trust Weber, Trost, Weiss, and Müller enough to disclose to them that 2 days later, on Sunday, November 4th, a coup, planned by Erich Ludendorff, pro-Nazi nationalist leader Hermann Kreibel, and himself, was to take place during the dedication of the monument to the 13,000 men from Munich killed during the World War, which had been erected next to the Army Museum behind the Hofgarten. The event would feature all Munich-based military units, paramilitary groups, and student groups, as well as the political elite of Bavaria. The plan was for Hitler to run up the stairs of the museum after all official speeches had been given and to confront the members of the Bavarian government. The idea was that he would ask Kahr, for everyone to hear, why it was impossible to buy bread anywhere, even though bakeries were full of flour. In the ensuing chaos, Ludendorff, Kreibel, and Hitler were supposed to approach the military and paramilitary groups present and have them arrest the government and proclaim a new government there and then. But on November 4th, things turned out differently. Munich's population responded neither in the kind of patriotic fashion that the government had in mind, nor with the spirit that the putschists expected. Trost was surprised how few people in Munich had put up flags outside their houses, despite having been urged to do so. At the memorial event, too, the public already was venting its own discontent. Trost heard people say, "Well, if the dead hear all these speeches, they'll turn in their graves." Others said, "Why can't Kahr finally get bread for everyone, rather than engage in celebrations all the time?" Also, and more important, Ludendorff, to the surprise of everyone, was not present. Either by design or by coincidence, the Bavarian state police had not picked him up for the event as arranged. It did not cross the mind of the would-be putschists that the behavior of the state police might have been a litmus test of how the Bavarian police stood toward a possible putsch. The conspirators, convinced they still had the support of everyone who mattered, decided not to abandon their plans for a coup and to try again on another day. On Sunday night, Trost attended a séance at the house of his sister-in-law, Dorothy, who, in a darkened room, attempted to summon the spirits and tell the future. Yet, ultimately he decided not to leave the future to the spirits, and spent the next few days urging his associates to strike as soon as possible, particularly as the economic situation was taking a dramatic turn for the worse. The 138 million marks that had bought him a train ticket from northern Germany to Munich the previous week were worthless now, with the price of a pound of bread now standing at 36 billion marks. Even well-dressed women were seen begging in the streets of Munich. As Trost recalled, some of the Oberland leaders told Weber, unless they soon sprang into action, it would no longer be possible to tell the difference between communists and people going hungry. On Wednesday, November 7th, Weber handed Trost a train ticket as well as 1 trillion marks and asked, on Ludendorff's behalf, that he immediately make his way to Berlin, or Neue Jerusalem, New Jerusalem, as Trost dismissively called Germany's capital, due to the purported power of Jews there. His task was to co-opt the city's nationalist circles into the putsch in Munich, and thus facilitate the spread of the coup to Berlin. Yet, once in Germany's capital, only one of the right-wing figures with whom Trost met was willing to come with him to Munich. As the episode reveals, Ludendorff, Hitler, and their co-conspirators were deluded about the level of support they enjoyed nationally. On November 8th, Hitler believed the time had come to strike immediately and begin his putsch. Around 8:45, without having sufficiently liaised with other groups he expected to participate in it, Hitler and his followers stormed into a fully packed event at the Bürgerbräukeller beer hall, at which Kahr was speaking and that featured almost the entire Bavarian political establishment. Hitler fired his revolver into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had started. He had imagined that Kahr would support a National Socialist-led national revolution if presented with it as a fait accompli, and, indeed, under the impact of the events that were unfolding, Kahr and his top aides Colonel Hans Ritter von Seisser and General Otto von Lossow initially expressed support for the revolution. But within hours they withdrew their support and instructed Bavarian state authorities to take measures to put down the putsch. From within the Bürgerbräukeller, Munich police chief Karl Mantel had already tried in vain to alert the Bavarian state police about the coup so that it could take immediate action against Hitler. The authorities acted quickly to outlaw the NSDAP that very night. The putsch had failed. As was to be expected, Kahr and others had wanted to use Hitler to further their own goals, not to be used by an upstart like him. At that time, Hitler was hardly anyone's messiah among the political and social establishment of Munich. Melanie Lehmann, the wife of publisher Lehmann, would write to Erich Ludendorff that it had been Hitler's mistake to have misjudged how closely tied Kahr was to the Centre Party, as in the Bavarian People's Party, and how powerful he was. Even prior to Kahr's decision to withdraw support for the putsch, General Friedrich Kresch von Kressenstein, who during the First World War had saved the Jewish community of Jerusalem by intervening against an Ottoman deportation order, and who now was the deputy commander of Reichswehr units based in Bavaria, had sprung into action. He issued an edict that any orders originating from his superior, Otto von Lossow, should be treated as being void and having been issued under duress. Even though the putsch had been a colossal failure, Hitler, Ludendorff, and their supporters would not accept defeat. Not wanting to bow out without embarking on a last-ditch attempt to reverse their fortunes, they decided to march the following day through central Munich to the building of the former Ministry of War, in the hope of thereby triggering Bavaria's Reichswehr leadership into participating in the putsch. Many nationalists in Munich joined Hitler that day. Even Paul Ostreicher, a pediatrician, Jewish convert to Protestantism, and veteran of the Freikorps Bamberg, intended to join the march in the apparent belief that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not really racially motivated. It was only at the urging of one of his colleagues, who was concerned how National Socialists would respond to the presence of someone of Jewish birth among their numbers, that he abandoned his plan at the last minute. It might well have been safe for Ostreicher to join the events of the day, for the march featured Erich Blesser, who, according to Nazi criteria of the 1930s, was a half-Jew, and yet he was a member of both the NSDAP and the SA. Despite his receiving a Blood Order medal as a veteran of the putsch, the Gestapo would target his mother, Rosa, in 1938, as a result of which she would commit suicide. Despite the influx of new supporters, Hitler, Ludendorff, and their followers never made it to the Ministry of War. As they marched along Residenzstrasse and were about to step out onto Odeonsplatz, they suddenly saw in front of them a Bavarian state police unit under the leadership of Michael von Godin. Just as in the case of his peer from the Liebregiment, Anton von Arco, the assassin of the slain leader of the Bavarian Revolution, Kurt Eisner, Godin was equally prepared to take action against Hitler and Eisner alike. It has never been resolved who shot first, but a firefight ensued that left 15 putschists and 4 policemen dead. Erwin von Schubner-Richter, who was marching right next to Hitler, was among those killed. Hitler was pulled to the ground by the dying Schubner-Richter, dislocating Hitler's arm but saving his life. His bodyguard Ulrich Graf then shielded him with his body from the gunfire. Riddled by bullets, Graf miraculously lived to tell the tale, but for the rest of his life would have to live with bullets in his head that could not be removed. When, finally, the firefight died down, 2 of Hitler's men, a young physician and a medical orderly, picked up the injured National Socialist leader from the street, quickly carried him to the rear, put him on one of the open cars that had followed their march, and drove off as quickly as they could. Almost a century later, due to its long-term consequences, the putsch looks like a monumental event. Yet, in reality, what took place on Odeonsplatz was quite localized. Around the same time that shots were exchanged between state police and the putschists, Hitler's friend Helene Hofstengel took a tram along Barrestrasse, just 3 blocks to the west of Odeonsplatz, totally oblivious to what was happening. She spent 20 minutes waiting at Munich's train station and then left by rail for Uffing, without realizing what had been happening elsewhere in central Munich or knowing what would shortly follow. The physician and the medical orderly who had taken Hitler to safety tried to flee with him to Austria, yet, just before reaching the Alps, their car broke down, an event of world historical consequences. Had Hitler reached the Austrian border, there would have been no trial and no incarceration in Landsberg, and more likely than not, he would be today nothing but a footnote of history. When Hitler realized that they were in the vicinity of Uffing am Staffelsee, he suggested that they hide in a nearby forest until nightfall and then make their way to the Hofstengel's house under the cover of darkness. When they finally arrived at the house and Helene Hofstengel opened her door for them, she let in a pale and mud-covered Hitler. Hitler spent the evening and night in feverish excitement, but finally managed to get some rest. On awakening the following day, Saturday, November 10th, he decided that he had to continue his flight to Austria. He therefore requested that the medical orderly return by train to Munich and asked the Bechsteins, the Berlin-based owners of a piano factory and close supporters of Hitler, who were staying in Bavaria at the time, to hand their car over to Max Amann, the managing director of the NSDAP, so that he could come and fetch him and take him across the border to Austria. In his hour of greatest need, Hitler thus decided to rely on the 2 Helenas, the German girl from New York and his closest supporter from Berlin, rather than on his Munich associates. For the next day and a half, he waited impatiently for the arrival of Bechstein's car. Unbeknownst to him, the Bechsteins were out in the countryside, which is why Hitler's request reached them with much delay. By Sunday afternoon, Amann finally left Munich by car, but so did an arrest squad charged with seizing Hitler. Hitler, meanwhile, paced up and down Helene Hofstengel's living room, wearing her husband's dark blue bathrobe, as he no longer could don the jacket of his suit due to his dislocated arm. He alternated between moving around silently and moodily and expressing his concern about the fate of his comrades in the putsch, telling Helene that, next time, he would do everything differently. He grew increasingly concerned that there had been no word about the whereabouts of Bechstein's car, growing ever more worried that it might not get to Uffing in time for him to flee across the mountains to Austria. Just after 5:00 p.m., the telephone rang. It was Helene's mother-in-law calling from her nearby house. She told Helene that her home was at that moment being searched for Hitler, and that the arrest squad would proceed to Helene's house any minute. Helene broke the bad news to Hitler, whereupon he lost his nerve completely. Throwing up his hands and exclaiming, "Now all is lost, no use going on," he turned with a quick movement to the cabinet upon which he had laid his revolver earlier in the afternoon. He seized the weapon and held it to his head. Yet, unlike him, Helene kept her cool. She stepped forward calmly and took the weapon from him without using any force, asking him what he thought he was doing. How could he give up at his first reversal? She told him to think of all his followers who believed in him and in his idea of saving the country, and who would lose all faith if he deserted them now, whereupon Hitler sank into a chair. He buried his head in his hands, sitting motionless, while Helene quickly hid the revolver in a flour canister. Irrespective of whether Hitler seriously contemplated committing suicide, His behavior reveals in how dark a state of mind he was in the aftermath of the failed coup. Once Helena had managed to calm him down, she told him that he should instruct her what should be done after his inevitable arrest. She scribbled down into a notebook what he wanted his followers and his lawyer to do. Thinking fast, he had to come up with who was likely to be unharmed and not arrested, as well as to devise a plan off the cuff for how his party could avoid deflating like a balloon in the wake of the failed putsch. He told Helena that he wanted Max Amann to make sure that the finances and business matters of the party would be kept in order. Alfred Rosenberg was supposed to look after the NSDAP's organ, the Völkischer Beobachter. Her husband was to use his foreign connections to build up the newspaper. Rudolf Buttmann, the nationalist who had toyed with overthrowing Bavaria's revolutionary leadership in the winter of 1918-19, and who since then had moved closer and closer to Hitler, and Hitler's longtime collaborator Hermann Esser, meanwhile, were tasked with carrying on the political operations of the party, while Helena Beckstein was to be asked to continue her generous help for the party. Hitler then quickly signed the orders, whereupon Helena slipped the notebook into the flour canister, too. At around 6 o'clock p.m., the arrest squad arrived at Helena Hofstangel's house. Soldiers, policemen, and police dogs surrounded the house, and Hitler was arrested and taken to a prison in nearby Wilhelm, still wearing Ernst Hofstangel's dark blue robe. 1 hour later, and 1 hour too late, Amann, deeply worried about the fate of Der Chef, arrived at the Hofstangel's house in the Beckstein car. Even though he did not come in time, he was relieved and overjoyed to hear that Hitler was safe. Amann told Helena that, as Hitler had threatened more than once to kill himself in the presence of his fellow National Socialist leaders, he had feared his boss might have taken his life. Soon, Hitler was transferred to Landsberg Fortress, a modern prison approximately 40 miles to the west of Munich. It was not a military fortress, as the term fortress in this context simply denotes a prison for people convicted of high treason. At Landsberg, he was first put under protective custody and subsequently awaited his trial. Soon after his arrival, a physician examined him, noting details about Hitler's dislocated arm and also a birth defect, a cryptorchidism on the right-hand side, that is, an undescended right testicle. Hitler's birth defect would become the subject of a popular mocking song in Britain, "Hitler has only got one ball." It remains unresolved to the present day how the news of it had made its way to Britain. It is possible that the birth defect explains why, for the rest of his life, Hitler was reluctant to undress, even in front of a physician, and why for many years he was unwilling to enter into intimate relationships with women. For instance, in the early 1920s, he spent so much time with Jenny Haug, an Austrian émigré in Munich like him, that everybody thought that the two were romantically involved. Behind Hitler's back, people referred to Jenny as his bride. They even celebrated Christmas 1922 with each other, and yet their relationship is unlikely to have taken more than an innocent romantic form. For Hitler, all seemed lost in Landsberg. At first he refused to give testimony and went on a hunger strike, during which he lost 11 pounds. He seems to have feared returning to being a nobody. Despite his national campaign earlier in the year to boost his national profile, for most Germans Hitler had remained faceless. Furthermore, in the eyes of the public, a Ludendorff putsch, rather than a Hitler putsch, had just taken place. For instance, in the faraway Rhineland, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary the day after the event, "In Bavaria, a coup by nationalists. Ludendorff again happened to go on a stroll." The way people talked or wrote about Hitler between November 9th and the beginning of his trial in late February also demonstrates that despite his efforts to transition in the public eye from being a drummer to a leader, he was not seen as the driving force behind the putsch, let alone as Germany's future leader. For instance, in December 1923, Melanie Lehmann came to the conclusion that had the putsch been successful, a position would have been created for Hitler which would have given him the opportunity to prove that he was capable of achieving something outstanding. Her husband had made a similar point in a letter to Gustav von Kahr. In Hitler, I saw a man who, through his brilliant talents in certain fields, was destined to be that drummer that Lloyd George once claimed Germany did not possess. For that reason, I should have liked to give him a post that would have enabled him to put his outstanding gifts to the service of the fatherland. In the winter of 1923-1924, hardly anyone believed that Hitler, if he were to have any political future, would be Germany's leader. As Melanie Lehman wrote in her diary on November 25, 1923, she hoped that Hitler would eventually return and work under the leadership of someone greater than him. Hans Probst, too, saw Hitler in February 1923 as not a leader but a wonderful agitator who would pave the way for someone even greater than him. Hitler was depressed for weeks, but in the new year he started to see light at the end of the tunnel. As a psychological report on him, dated January 8, 1924, concluded, Hitler is full of enthusiasm about the thought of a greater united Germany and is of a lively temperament. In particular, the death of the Russian Bolshevik leader Lenin on February 21st lifted his spirits. He now expected the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. Finally, the political goal about which he so often had spoken with Erwin von Scheubner-Richter seemed to be in reach: a permanent alliance between a Völkisch Germany and a monarchist Russia. As Scheubner-Richter had written in an article published on November 9, 1923, the day he was shot dead, the national Germany and the national Russia must find a common path for the future, and it is therefore necessary that the Völkisch circles of both countries meet today. 5 days after Lenin's death, Hitler's trial started at the People's Court in Munich, which met in the building of the Central Infantry School on Blutenberg Street in central Munich. During the trial, which would last until March 27th, Hitler was one of 10 defendants, only one of whom had been born in Munich. Of the remaining 9, none was native to southern Bavaria. During the court proceedings, things started to turn in his favor. In the 5 weeks that his trial lasted, the failed coup retrospectively metamorphosed from a Ludendorff putsch into a Hitler putsch. In fact, his trial was far more transformative for Hitler than would be the publication of Mein Kampf, as it provided him with a national stage from which he could voice his political ideas. Up to the time of the failed putsch, he had stood, particularly outside Munich, very much in the shadow of Ludendorff, however hard Hitler had attempted to boost his national profile through the publication of his book and the reversal of his ban on being photographed. People who had been advocating a putsch in the autumn of 1923 had viewed Ludendorff as their future leader, Hitler as only the general's aide. Through the trial, Hitler was transformed from that aide and local tribune into the person he wanted to be all along, a figure with a national profile. See images 26 and 27. How did he accomplish this? Hitler cleverly used his courtroom appearances to put himself in the tradition of Kemal Pasha and Mussolini, arguing that just as they had done in Turkey and Italy, he had committed high treason so as to bring freedom to Germany. It seems that only once his trial started did it dawn upon him what an opportunity the trial provided him. Initially, he had attempted to use his courtroom appearances to bring attention to the involvement of the Bavarian establishment and of his co-conspirators in plans to overthrow the government. However, everyone else had a self-interest to minimize his own involvement and to scapegoat Hitler by exaggerating the role the NSDAP leader supposedly had played. Eventually, Hitler embraced the version of events that everyone else was trying to tell, as it allowed him to present himself as a far more central figure than he really had been. This is why today the events of November 9, 1923, are known as the Hitler Putsch, rather than the Ludendorff Putsch, as contemporaries had initially called the coup. As Hitler brilliantly exploited the stage that was offered to him in the trial, he became a household name all over Germany. People all around the country were taken by Hitler's courtroom statement that, following his inevitable conviction and prison term, he would take off exactly from where he had been forced to stop on November 9th. He added, "The army which we have formed grows day to day. It grows more rapidly from hour to hour. Even now I have the proud hope that one day the hour will come when these untrained, wild bands will grow to battalions, the battalions to regiments, and the regiments to divisions, and the reconciliation will come in that eternal last court of judgment, the court of God, before which we are ready to take our stand. Then from our bones, from our graves, will sound the voice of that tribunal which alone has the right to sit in judgment upon us." Hitler told the judges, "You may pronounce us guilty 1,000 times, but the goddess who presides over the eternal court of history will with a smile tear in pieces the charge of the public prosecutor and the verdict of this court, for she acquits us." How much Hitler's trial transformed his public image and national profile can be traced in Goebbels' diary. Whereas Goebbels had referred only to Ludendorff when chronicling the putsch in his diary in November and had eulogized Lenin on his death, he mentioned Hitler and the National Socialist movement for the first time in his diary only on March 13, 1924, noting that he was taken by the combination of socialism and Christ in National Socialism, its rejection of materialism, as well as by its ethical foundations. For the next 9 days, as Hitler's trial continued, every single one of his diary entries mentioned Hitler, as Goebbels attempted to learn as much as possible about Hitler during that period. On March 20th, 1924, toward the end of the 4th week of Hitler's trial, and just 1 week after mentioning him in his diary for the first time, Goebbels defined Hitler as a messiah in words similar to those that he would use more or less consistently for the next 21 years. He celebrated Hitler as an idealist who is full of enthusiasm, as someone who would give the German people new hope, and whose will would find a way to succeed. On March 22, 1924, Goebbels recorded that he could not help but think about Hitler. For him, there was no one like Hitler in Germany. He was, for Goebbels, the most fervent Glühenster German. The story of Hitler's coup is one of recklessness, megalomania, and spectacular failure. His strategy to boost his national profile was a clever one, but then things had gone off the rails. His attempt to head a Bavarian revolution that would be carried on to Berlin had failed from start to finish. He had thought of killing himself, even if he had not followed through with it. However, in defeat, he had managed to accomplish what he had failed to do when he believed he was in the ascendancy. His photo campaign and his book, published under Korber's name, had come too late to give him a national profile in time for the coup, yet his trial managed to accomplish exactly that. It catapulted him to national fame. On day 1 of the trial, he had been a defendant in the Ludendorff trial, which by the time of his conviction had been transformed into the Hitler trial. But from Hitler's perspective, his triumph was bittersweet, as he was about to be locked up for quite some time. On April 1st, 1924, he was sentenced to a 5-year term in Landsberg Fortress, where he would be out of sight and earshot of the public eye and ear. Every expectation was that the trial had given Hitler his 15 minutes of fame, which would fade over time as other prominent political figures emerged on the populist right. Chapter 14. Lebensraum. Spring 1924 to 1926. While he was incarcerated, Hitler's star, against all expectations, did not fade. Soon he became the stuff of legends and of admiration. People started to view him as a people's tribune, incarcerated behind the thick walls of Landsberg Fortress. It was then that Munich's upper-class society began to take an interest in him. For instance, Elsa Bruckmann, who had never met Hitler prior to the putsch, now bombarded him with letters, books, and parcels full of food and treats, as did many others. By mid-May, Rudolf Hess, who was incarcerated along with him, reported that Hitler no longer appeared emaciated. According to Hess, Hitler looked really good, due not only to all the sleep and exercise he was getting while incarcerated, but also to the almost constant arrival of packages full of sweet cakes, mixed pickles, sausages, and canned food. As Kurt Ludecker, one of Hitler's most ardent supporters in the early 1920s, recalled of his visit to Landsberg, in captivity Hitler had been thriving. He was wearing leather shorts and a Tyrolean jacket, his shirt open at the throat. His cheeks glowed with healthy red, and his eyes shone. The fire-eater had not been quenched by his time serving. On the contrary, he looked better physically and seemed happier than I had ever seen him. Landsberg had done him a world of good. Elsa Bruckmann also paid Hitler 2 visits. She would subsequently recall of the first that, en route to Landsberg, her heart had been pounding at the thought of thanking face to face the man who had awakened me and so many others, and shown us once more the light in the darkness and the path that would lead to light. At the fortress, Hitler greeted her in Bavarian costume and with a yellow linen jacket. She was smitten by the man in lederhosen. He was, for her, simple, natural, a cavalier with a clear gaze. In the few short minutes that she and Hitler spent together, she passed on greetings from students who had participated in the failed putsch, as well as from Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Before leaving, she told Hitler that deep loyalty awaited him upon his release. Loyalty to the last breath. During the 8 minutes that Elsa Bruckmann had with Hitler at Landsberg, the seed of a fateful relationship that would last 2 decades was sown. Following his early release on probation on December 20th, 1924, she would invite him regularly to her salon and open the doors to Munich's upper class that hitherto had remained closed to the leader of the National Socialists. Bruckmann was just one of many visitors who ensured that Hitler would not be forgotten while locked away in the Bavarian countryside. He almost held court at Landsberg, as his trial and conviction had turned him into a mysterious political celebrity. In total, 330 visitors spent a total of 158 hours and 27 minutes with him between the time of his conviction and his release. Of course, some of the visits were by his lawyers, but most were not. Many were by Helena and Edwin Bechstein, Hitler's most ardent supporters from Berlin, who spent almost 18.5 hours with him. Hermine Hoffmann, the widow from a suburb of Munich whom Hitler labeled his Mutter, came to see him a total of 7 times. Even his beloved dog came to visit him, as his landlord, Maria Reichart, brought the German Shepherd along with her. Other visitors included his political associates, and another was one of his former regimental commanders. But Ernst Schmidt stopped by only once. Not exactly a high number of visits for someone who had been so very close to Hitler during the war and its aftermath. Significantly, many visits were by newly won admirers. Even Hitler's half-sister Angela visited him once, to celebrate his name day on June 17th, the day of St. Adolf. The manager of the Jewish student cafeteria in Vienna, Angela initially had refused to be in touch with her brother following his arrest. As Otto Lebold, the warden of Landsberg Fortress, recorded in his private notes in late 1923, Hitler's 2 sisters do not want to receive news from the prison because they have no sympathy for the anti-Semitic conduct of their brother, the greatest German anti-Semitic leader. However, even now, Hitler kept his distance from pan-German notables who had once been close to the Thule Society and Karl Harrer's vision for the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP. Despite the fairly frequent visits to their son-in-law, Friedrich Weber, who was incarcerated along with Hitler, Julius Friedrich and Melanie Lehmann did not meet with Hitler. On their own, of course, his visitors would have been unable to keep Hitler in the public limelight. His rising fame resulted from 2 other factors. First, the astonishing failure of other populist right-wing leaders to fill Hitler's shoes. As a result of the constant infighting and bickering between its senior figures, no new serious contender to unite the radical right emerged. And second, Hitler wrote another book at Landsberg Fortress, and this time he did not hide behind another author. Hitler's time at Landsberg was indeed most important for the fact that he started working there on Mein Kampf, which was to be published in 2 volumes in July 1925 and in late 1926, respectively. Initially, he had planned to bring out the book under the title 4,5 Jahre Kampf gegen Lüge, Dummheit und Feigheit, eine Abrechnung, 4.5 years of struggle against lies, idiocy, and cowardice, a settling of scores, a reference both to his time in the DAP, NSDAP, and to his service in the war, but he eventually shortened the title to Mein Kampf. Hitler also decided against venting his frustration at those who had not supported him or who, in his mind, had betrayed him in the run-up to the putsch. In fact, the one thing Mein Kampf did not cover was the failed coup, almost certainly because he was depending on the goodwill of those with whom he wanted to settle scores, in other words, the political and social elite of Bavaria, to gain him early release from Landsberg Fortress. Once released, Hitler would likely not have wanted to risk being put back behind bars, as he was still on probation, or being deported from Germany, as he still held no German citizenship. The Bavarian cabinet indeed had discussed inconclusively, as early as April 1924, whether Hitler should be deported to Austria. The first volume of Mein Kampf, which is more than 400 pages long, constituted an autobiographical, semi-fictional Bildungsroman of Hitler's life from his birth in 1889 to the time of the issuance of the German Workers' Party, DAP, program in 1920. In it, he describes how the experiences of his childhood, adolescence, and the First World War revealed to him how, behind the scenes, the world was held together. In doing so, he implicitly presented himself as a genius who came from below with extraordinary innate qualities to understand the hidden architecture of the world. He did not use his autobiography to chronicle past life experiences, as autobiographies normally do. Rather, he used it as a manifesto of what he intended to do. Volume 1 of Mein Kampf was meant as a book of revelation. In it, Hitler explained how he translated his revelations into prescriptions for how Germany and the world at large would have to be reformed. He presented himself as a kind of male Cinderella, or strong Hans, the character of one of the fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm, as the boy from Braunau who was to save Germany by finding answers to the questions of how November 9th, 1918, the date signifying both Germany's loss of the First World War and the outbreak of revolution, could have happened, and of what political lessons should be drawn from the collapse of Germany in November 1918. Even though self-dramatization is the essence of politics, the degree to which Hitler lied about his own life in Mein Kampf is quite astonishing. His account is at times almost fictional in character. Yet his constant lying makes perfect sense, as his goal was to tell a version of his life that would allow him to draw from it political lessons that supported his political beliefs in 1924. Hitler thus ruthlessly reinvented his own past so as to tell politically expedient tales. For instance, he presented himself as a typical product of his First World War regiment to reinforce the political message that the war had made him and had produced National Socialism. Were he to have admitted that even though he was a conscientious soldier, the men in the trenches had perceived him as an Etappenschwein, rear-echelon pig, the story of his First World War experiences would have been worse than useless politically. The second volume, by contrast, was a more traditional programmatic political manifesto. In it, Hitler essentially presented the same ideas he had already developed in Volume 1, However, they were laid out in a more detailed fashion and took the form of political proclamations, a more conventional genre. There was also more of a focus on foreign affairs, as Hitler wrote Volume 2 of Mein Kampf in September and October 1926, well after his release from Landsberg. He went to the mountains close to Berchtesgaden to work on the book, and composed it in a hut adjacent to the inn where he had visited his mentor, Dietrich Eckart, 2 years earlier. Eckart had died of a heart attack on Boxing Day, December 26, 1923. While writing the second volume of Mein Kampf, Hitler felt intellectually and emotionally so close to his paternal mentor, who now lay buried in a nearby valley, that he dedicated the volume to Eckart. And yet, Eckart does not feature in Mein Kampf. As Eckart was dead, Hitler could also ignore his mentor's insistence that Jews were not really a biological race, and that human existence depended on the antithesis between Aryans and Jews. The one, Eckart believed, could not exist without the other. As he had written in Auf gut Deutsch in 1919, the end of all times would come if the Jewish people perished. There was an even more important reason for Hitler's failure to mention Eckart in Mein Kampf. The fact that his mentor had explained the world to Hitler in the years following the First World War would have contradicted the story Hitler was trying to tell, that is, the story of a young soldier who, by virtue of his innate genius and of his own experiences between 1889 and 1918, had experienced an epiphany at war's end at Pasewalk Military Hospital and thus decided to go into politics and save Germany. It is no coincidence that both volumes of Mein Kampf often use biblical references and themes. While he could not refer to himself as a messiah as blatantly as he did in the book published under Körber's name, he did so in a more subtle way in Mein Kampf. Just as he had done ever since the moment of his politicization and radicalization in the summer of 1919, while writing Mein Kampf, he did not strive merely to find policy solutions to the challenges of the day. Rather, his goal was to define how Germany could be made safe for all times. In fact, he repeatedly used the phrase "for all time" in Mein Kampf. For instance, in Volume 2, he discussed how, someday, a people of state citizens can arise, bound to one another and forged together by a common love and a common pride, unshakable and invincible for all time. Hitler's book was not unreadable. It was, however, extremely long-winded, essentially a series of speech scripts. Hitler was really an orator, not a writer, even though for the previous few years he had stated he was a writer every time he was asked to provide his profession. In other words, he clearly had aspirations to be a writer, but his talents were those of an orator. Without his performative act and the support of the power of his voice, many of his chapters came over as dry. Even readers supportive of Hitler did not exactly devour the book. For instance, Joseph Goebbels started reading Mein Kampf on August 10, 1925. That day, he wrote in his diary, "I am reading Hitler's book Mein Kampf, and I am shaken by this political confession." Nevertheless, it would take Hitler's future propaganda minister a little more than 2 months to finish the book. Even though, in Mein Kampf, Hitler generally did not disclose the sources upon which his ideas in the book were based, he was not trying to pretend that all were truly original and never would. For instance, on the night of July 21-22, 1941, he would state at his military HQ that every human is the product of his own ideas and of the ideas of others. He had not meant his book to be a doctoral dissertation, but a political proclamation or manifesto. It was hardly unusual for politicians and revolutionary leaders not to reference their writings. More important, Mein Kampf was not targeted at a general readership, but aimed to preach to the converted. He was not trying first and foremost to recruit new supporters. His primary goal was to address his followers at a time when, being imprisoned, he was both unable and forbidden to speak publicly to them, so as to avoid being pushed to the sidelines and replaced by somebody else. His readers were thus familiar with the general ideas from which Hitler had been drawing in defining and presenting his own political convictions. It would have been pointless and redundant for him to lay out in detail the sources upon which he based his own ideas. For a different reason than keeping in touch with his admirers, the writing of Mein Kampf may have been of pivotal importance for Hitler. Researching and writing Mein Kampf while being incarcerated gave him time to think about and reconsider his political goals. On the night of February 3rd and 4th, 1942, he would state that it was only while writing his book that he fully thought through many of the things that he previously had propagated without much reflection. It was through constant thinking, he added, that he gained clarity about those things about which he hitherto had only had a hunch. This is why Hitler retrospectively referred to his time at Landsberg as a university education paid for by the state. While in Landsberg University, Hitler re-evaluated his initial answers from 1919 and after to the question of how a new and sustainable Germany could be erected. In the process of doing so, his answers and thus his ideology changed radically. It is here where the real significance of Mein Kampf lies. As the first volume sold very slowly initially and the second volume hardly at all, Mein Kampf's importance during the 1920s lay not in its impact on its readership, but in the way the process of writing it fundamentally transformed Hitler's ideas and sustained his political metamorphosis. Much of what he expressed in Mein Kampf was, of course, well in line with what he had said in his many speeches between 1919 and 1923. The first volume also included a discussion of how political propaganda is to be conducted, which was based on the lessons that he drew from British and German wartime propaganda. Even though this discussion was well written and laid out Hitler's own approach to the role of propaganda in politics, nothing in it would have been surprising for someone familiar with his speeches. However, while writing his book, Hitler also drew 3 political lessons that were either new for him or previously had not been prominent for him. Mein Kampf matters first and foremost for these lessons. One was that using force to gain power was no longer viable. As Hitler was to recall during the Second World War, the new state by 1924 had become too stable and was in firm control of most weapons in the country. As a result, he henceforth would pursue a legalistic, parliamentary rather than a revolutionary path toward power. The second and third lessons would have even more dire consequences. He now discarded the answers that he previously had given to the question of how to create a new Germany that never again would lose a major war. His new answers were based on the theory of Lebensraum, living space, and on the racial ideas of Hans Gunther, the author of Rassenkunde des deutschen Volkes, which would be the most influential book on racial theory in the Third Reich. As long as Erwin von Schubner-Richter and Lenin had been alive, the acquisition of Lebensraum had not played any significant role in Hitler's thought, but in the wake of Lenin's death it had become clear that Hitler had been wrong in expecting an imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. Due to this realization and his recognition that Russian monarchists would be unable to launch a putsch in the future, Hitler's previous security strategy had become obsolete. There would be no German-Russian fascist-monarchist alliance. This is why, in Mein Kampf, he devised a radically different answer to Germany's security dilemma. Rather than form a sustainable alliance in the East, Germany would have to acquire, colonize, and subjugate new territory there so as to become the hegemon of the Eurasian landmass and thus be safe for all time. According to Hitler's understanding of international affairs, which he believed was undergoing a fundamental change, Germany needed to expand. In language reminiscent of German militarist writing from the pre-First World War era, this was an all-or-nothing question of national survival for the country. Germany will be either a world power or will not be at all. Hitler argued that the German people can defend its future only as a world power, adding, "In an epoch when the earth is gradually being divided among states, some of which encompass almost whole continents, one cannot speak of a structure as a world power, the political mother country of which is limited to the ridiculous area of barely 500,000 square kilometers. It was in this context that he came across the term Lebensraum. It was a term Rudolf Hess's professor and mentor Karl Haushofer had developed, which captured what Hitler wanted to express better than Bodenerwerb, acquisition of land, the word that he still was using in his draft notes for Mein Kampf from June 1924. Hitler did not really engage himself with Haushofer's work and the conceptual framework behind the professor's term. Rather, he was attracted by Lebensraum because it gave a name to something he had been thinking about as he was attempting to find a new answer to Germany's security dilemma, namely, that states had to have sufficient territory to be able to feed their population, to prevent emigration, and to be sufficiently strong vis-à-vis other states. The term does not appear often in Mein Kampf. However, it is used in answering the core question of Hitler's book, how Germany's security dilemma can be solved. As he wrote in Mein Kampf, the National Socialist movement must, then, without regard to traditions and prejudices, find the courage to assemble our people and their might for a march forward on that road which leads out of the present constriction of our living space, the domain of life, and hence also permanently liberates us from the danger of vanishing off this earth, or having to enter the service of others as a slave nation. Further, he wrote, we National Socialists, however, must go further. The right to soil and territory can become a duty if decline seems to be in store for a great nation unless it extends its territory. We take up at the halting place of 600 years ago. We terminate the endless German drive to the south and west of Europe and direct our gaze toward the lands in the east. We finally terminate the colonial and trade policy of the pre-war period and proceed to the territorial policy of the future. But if we talk about new soil and territory in Europe today, we can think primarily only of Russia and its vassal border states. If Germany's security could only be achieved through the acquisition of Lebensraum in the East, as the promise of the re-established nationalist Russia had gone up in thin air, Germany had to look for alliances elsewhere. As Goebbels noted in his diary on April 13, 1926, based on his reading of Mein Kampf, Italy and England are our allies. Russia wants to devour us. Hitler's major realignment of how he viewed the great powers of the world also resulted in a sudden shift in his attitude toward France. Whereas in the first volume of Mein Kampf he barely had mentioned Germany's neighbor to the west, he referred to France very frequently in the second volume. In fact, references to France rose by almost 1,400%. France now was presented in terms of a fundamental threat to Germany's security. As Hitler's goal was to achieve parity with the Anglo-American world and, as he no longer believed in a German-Russian alliance, it was imperative for him that Germany become Europe's hegemon. Little surprise, then, that Hitler's animus against France and Russia, the two countries that geopolitically stood in Germany's way to becoming Europe's hegemon, became more prominent than previously had been the case. Curiously, Poland, the country that would be second to none in the harshness with which it would be treated by Hitler in the Second World War, hardly features at all in Mein Kampf. At that time, Poland barely seems to have existed on his mental map. Hitler's anti-Slavic feelings did not run very deep, at least not then, as Poland was not a major player in international affairs and so did not pose, in Hitler's mind, a threat to Germany's national security. Poland would only matter to him in the years to come as a provider of territory and resources that would help make Germany sufficiently large to survive in a rapidly changing world. It is thus no surprise that on the eve of the Second World War, when Hitler shared his plans vis-à-vis Poland with his generals, his primary concern was how he could clear the Polish territory of its inhabitants, in the same way the Ottoman Empire had the Armenians during the First World War. In Mein Kampf, unlike in the past, Hitler also displayed a deep interest in racial theory. Questions of racial typology had not been high on his agenda prior to the putsch. Although the copy of Hans Gunther's Rassenkunde that Julius Friedrich Lehmann had sent to him in 1923 does not bear apparent traces of having been read, Hitler now engaged closely with Gunther's ideas of racial typologies. He, however, conveniently ignored that Gunther did not really believe Jews to be a race. It can no longer be established beyond reasonable doubt where Hitler's new interest in racial theory originated. However, it is surely of significance in a temporal sense that he turned toward ideas that would allow him to see Slavs as subhumans and to define the East as a territory for colonization at the very moment when it was politically expedient to do so. That moment had come when Hitler started to believe that a German-Russian alliance was no longer viable, and thus sought a new solution to Germany's security dilemma. This indicates that geopolitics trumped race for him. That is, in trying to find a solution to Germany's geopolitical predicament, he was willing fundamentally to change the character of his racism. At this point in time, racism was merely a tool for Hitler to address Germany's geopolitical challenge, so as to make Germany safe for all time. The sequence in which Hitler wrote the different chapters of the 2 volumes of Mein Kampf indeed supports the idea that he only changed his approach to racism after Lenin's death, when he no longer believed that his dream of a German-Russian permanent alliance would ever come true. Whereas those sections of his chapter on Volk und Raum, people and space, the chapter from his first volume dealing most explicitly with race, that took a historical approach to explaining Jewish characteristics had already been drafted in 1922 or 1923, the section that laid out Hitler's ideas about racial theory had only been prepared in the spring or early summer of 1924. It is here that Hitler presented ideas of racial typologies and hierarchies, and it is here that he painted the danger of racial mixing on the wall and sang the song of racial purity. There was also a change in the frequency with which Hitler discussed matters of race in the 2 installments. In Volume 2, Hitler mentioned race approximately 40% more often than in Volume 1. A comparison of the frequency of terms used in the 2 volumes does indeed reveal his changing preoccupations. The frequency of the term pan-German, Alldeutsch, for instance, which once had been of such central importance to Hitler, fell by 96%. Similarly, as Hitler started to be gradually less preoccupied with his original anti-capitalism, references to capitalism, Finanz, Spekulat, Wirtschaft, Bors, Kapital, Mammon, Zins, went down by 49%. Somewhat surprisingly, references to Jews fell sharply by 50%. Jud, with an asterisk, Jude, with an asterisk, Antisemit, with an asterisk, Zion, with an asterisk. The asterisk signifies that any word beginning with whatever came before the asterisk would be included. For example, Zion would include Zionismus, Zionistin, and so on. Meanwhile, unsurprisingly, references to the nation, the National Socialist movement, the state, might, war, and race went up as Hitler tried to figure out the details of how a new National Socialist state was to be configured. National Socialism, Nationalsozialism, and movement, Bewegung, rose by 102%, while the frequency of the term state, Staat, shot up by 90%. Might, Macht, rose by 44%. The figure for race, Ras, went up by 39%, and for war, Krieg, by 31%. The figure for nation, Nation, increased by 27%. People, Volk, rose by 26%. The aggregate for the 2 terms 1918 and Versailles also increased sharply by 179%. References to struggle, Kampf, meanwhile remained both frequent and constant. The frequency with which Hitler referred to different countries also changed significantly. It was not just that he suddenly displayed an interest in France. References to the country of his birth, Ulster, Wien, Habsburg, almost disappeared. They fell by 90%, whereas mentions of Italy, went up by 57%. As a testament of his central preoccupation with Anglo-American power, reference to Britain and the United States, Anglo, British, Angles, Anglo, Amérique, grew by 169%, whereas mentions of the West, Westen, doubled in frequency. References to communism, Marx, Bolshev, Socialist, Kommunist, doubled as well, while mentions of the Soviet Union even rose by a staggering 200%, Soviet, Russland, Rush, which reflected Hitler's new central preoccupation now that an alliance with a monarchist Russia was no longer an option. A final difference between the two volumes of Mein Kampf is worth noting. In the second volume of his book, Hitler referred to German Weltherrschaft, world domination, whereas in the first volume he had only charged Jews with aiming for Weltherrschaft. However, he used the term only once in the context of Germany. He stated that if Germany had been less of a country of individualists in the past, it could have achieved Weltherrschaft. What kind of world domination he was referring to only becomes apparent by looking at how Hitler used the term elsewhere in Mein Kampf. Toward the end of the second volume of his book, he talks about Britain's Weltherrschaft of the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. In other words, Hitler argues that if Germans had behaved more like Britons in the past, their country could have equaled the British Empire. Thus, Mein Kampf should not be read as a blueprint to rule single-handedly every corner of the world. Rather, it should be understood as a call to arms to achieve parity with the greatest empires of the world. Hitler's ideological and political evolution between the end of the First World War and the mid-1920s, as well as his occasional ideological flexibility and willingness to change some tenets of his ideas, should not be mistaken for opportunism. Nor was Hitler a demagogue who merely vented his frustrations, prejudices, and hatreds. Opportunism had certainly played a huge role in his life in the months following the end of the war. Even after that, opportunism competed, and would always do so, with his political convictions. He would do whatever it took to escape loneliness. And his narcissistic personality continually drove him to actions that would feed his grandiose sense of his own importance and uniqueness and his need for admiration. Nevertheless, Hitler rose to the helm of the NSDAP both for himself and for a cause in which he believed deeply. From the moment of his politicization and radicalization in the summer of 1919, Hitler genuinely strived to understand the world and to come up with a comprehensive plan for how Germany and the world could be cured of their ills. His repeated use of the term Weltanschauung, denoting a comprehensive philosophical conception of what holds the world together, is a clear sign that he aimed at devising a comprehensive, cohesive, and systematic political system. The fact that his political views continued to evolve between 1919 and 1926 does not contradict that he was aiming to devise his own Weltanschauung. It merely indicates that the Hitler of the early 1920s was still searching for the best answer to the question of how Germany had to be recast so as to survive in a rapidly changing world. Furthermore, his occasional ideological flexibility and the periodic sudden changes in his political ideas, as expressed, for instance, in the rapid changes to his racism in 1924, indicate that there were two parts to his worldview. The first part constituted an inner core set of ideas that were built upon irrational beliefs, but that were perfectly coherent if one accepted their underlying irrational first principles. Hitler's views about the Jews, about political economy and finance, about the nature of history and historical change, about human nature and social Darwinism, about governmental systems, about the need to bring all social classes together and establish socialism along national lines, about the need to build states that have sufficient territory and resources, and about the nature of the international system and geopolitics more generally were all part of that inner core. Anything beyond that, including ideas that were very important to many other National Socialists, was for Hitler the second part of his worldview. They functioned merely as a means to an end, which is why Hitler was extremely flexible when it came to them. He was willing to change them or even replace them with something else at any time, if expediency so demanded. With the completion of the writing of Mein Kampf, Hitler's metamorphosis from a nobody with still indeterminate and fluctuating political ideas to a National Socialist leader was complete. By the second half of the 1920s, the Adolf Hitler who, while in power, would almost bring the world to its knees, was becoming visible. For instance, soon after the publication of the second volume of Mein Kampf, the Heil Hitler greeting of National Socialists was introduced. However, the term Nazi had not yet become common currency in referring to Hitler and his followers. Other terms were in circulation that henceforth would fall out of use. For instance, in October 1926, people referred to National Socialists as Nazizozis. It was also only after 1924 that SA, Sturmabteilung, and party members would wear brown shirts. Prior to that, members of the SA had worn makeshift uniforms, which included the wearing of windbreakers and woolen ski hats. From the perspective of 1926, the year of publication of the second volume of Mein Kampf, Hitler's future and the fate of his ideas depended just as much on himself as they did on the choices and decisions of millions of Germans who, in the years to come, would sustain his rule and become implicated in the crimes of the Third Reich. The tragedy of Germany and the world is that Hitler found himself in Munich in the wake of the First World War and the Revolution of 1918-1919. Had it not been for the political situation of post-revolutionary Bavaria, as well as the semi-authoritarian political settlement of March 1920, there would have been no soil on which he and the NSDAP could have flourished. Likewise, the tragedy of Germany and the world was that between 1923 and the time he came to power in 1933, Germany as a whole did not resemble Bavaria more closely. Munich, in particular, proved politically to be a forbidding place for the NSDAP. Although the city had produced the party, the NSDAP struggled to attract voters in Bavaria's capital. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, 3 out of 5 voters in Munich supported either the BVP or the Social Democrats, while only 1 in 5 voted for the NSDAP. Due to the organizational strength of the BVP, Hitler's party would never become the strongest party in Bavaria in a free election. Democracy held out in Bavaria in 1933 longer than anywhere else in Germany. In short, had it not been for Bavaria, Hitler hardly would have metamorphosed into a National Socialist. But had the rest of Germany been more like Bavaria, Hitler is unlikely ever to have come to power. Epilogue. When the Harvard Museum of Germanic Art, now home to the university's Center for European Studies, commissioned Louis Rubinstein to paint frescoes for its entrance hall in the mid-1930s, the young American artist decided that he would use his art to attack and ridicule Hitler. The frescoes by the Jewish painter with family roots in Germany and Poland depicted scenes from the dictator's favorite operatic work, Richard Wagner's Ring of the Nibelung. At the center of his frescoes, right above the main entry to the museum, Rubinstein painted Hitler as Albric, the spiteful dwarf and antagonist of the heroes of the Ring cycle, chief among them Siegfried. When walking past Rubinstein's frescoes on the way to my office every day while researching this book, I often stopped to admire them. They cleverly turned Nazi mythology upside down. For German nationalists, Siegfried had become the symbolic personification of their country during the First World War. For instance, the most famous defense line of the Western Front had been called Siegfriedstellung, and the popular post-war right-wing charge against Jews, left-wingers, and liberals that they had treacherously stabbed a victorious Germany in the back was a reference to how Alberic's son Hagen had slain Siegfried. In Rubinstein's frescoes, it was no longer the Jews and Democrats, but Hitler and his followers who were the cowardly traitors to Germany. And yet, while looking at Rubinstein's Alberic, I could not help but feel that the fresco gets Hitler fundamentally wrong. See image 32. Presented as a dwarf who, through the denial of love, manages to turn gold into a magic ring that will allow him to rule the world, Hitler is reduced to an opportunist for whom nothing but a lust for power and domination counts. This view is well in line with that of the most famous Hitler biographer of the immediate post-Second World War era, Alan Bullock, and many others since. Rubinstein and Bullock at least understood that Hitler really did matter. Recently, in the country that he once ruled as a dictator, Hitler has become almost a non-entity, as a new generation of Germans understandably but ahistorically worries that placing emphasis on Hitler may appear apologetic and deflect the responsibility of ordinary Germans for the horrors of the Third Reich. Today it is as common to question whether Hitler was a historical figure of the highest significance as it is to portray him as little more than an empty canvas onto which other Germans painted their wishes and their goals. As this book reveals, Hitler was anything but merely an empty canvas that had been filled with the collective wishes of the Germans. Neither was he an opportunist for whom power mattered only for its own sake. Studying his metamorphosis between 1918 and 1926 helps us understand what fueled him, as well as the Third Reich, during the 1930s and 1940s. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, he would use his rhetorical style of demagoguery, in the form in which he had developed it between 1919 and 1923, to exploit the volatile and desperate public mood during the Great Depression. That would allow the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, to grow rapidly from having the support of just 2.6% of the population to being the largest party in Germany. Hitler would not repeat his tactical mistakes of 1923. And this time, he would not have to compete with a well-organized conservative party, the Bavarian People's Party, BVP, but with another, the German National People's Party, DNVP, that had recently been weakened by its takeover by a populist businessman, Alfred Hugenberg. The making of Hitler in post-revolutionary Munich gave birth to an ideology that would provide the central impetus for his actions between 1933 and 1945, and the emerging dynamics of how he defined and pursued political ideas in 1919 and the 5 years that followed would become the central driving force behind the progressive radicalization of both Hitler and the Third Reich after 1933. His intention to recast Germany so as to make the country sustainable within a rapidly changing world originated in his initial politicization and radicalization in the summer of 1919. It would remain the same until the day he died. All his policies, once in power, were thus directed toward that goal. Hitler remained as vague about some of his policy goals after 1933 as he had been when first devising them in the early 1920s. That vagueness encouraged improvisation by those working for him, counterintuitively establishing a highly successful system of political operations not in spite of, but precisely because of, its flexible and reactive character. In many cases, it fanned radicalization, as his followers tried to figure out what he would like them to do and competed with one another for his favor, each striving to offer the most comprehensive and the furthest-reaching solution. In such cases, in other words, in which people were trying to work toward the wishes of the Führer that had remained unspecific, his followers, rather than Hitler himself, fueled the regime's radicalization. Yet in policy areas that for Hitler lay at the core of recasting Germany and allowing it to survive for all time, he was not vague at all. Here he himself drove his regime's progressive radicalization between 1933 and 1945. Unlike many populists in history, he did not merely preach to make his country great again. He always was a person who wanted to understand the nature of things and to translate his insights into politics. When it came to the two policy areas that during the post-revolutionary period he had defined as key to overcoming the primary source of his country's weakness, that is, Germany's Jews and Germany's territory, Hitler's only flexibility lay in his preparedness to settle, for as long as was necessary, for second-best solutions if his preferred solution was still proving elusive. Hitler's two central policy goals, in the form in which he had defined them in 1919, would dominate his thinking and policies for the next 25 years. And they explain his willingness to start another world war and embarking on genocide. They were the total removal of any Jewish influence from Germany and the creation of a state that had sufficient territory, people, and resources to be geopolitically on equal footing with the most powerful states in the world. By the time of the writing of Mein Kampf, it had become clear that Hitler's preferred final solution to both problems, the supposedly poisonous influence of Jews and Germany's lack of space, would have genocidal consequences. Even from the perspective of 1924, once Hitler had abandoned the idea of a permanent alliance with a restored Tsarist Russia in favor of a sustainable Germany created through the grabbing of Lebensraum, the developmental logic of a pursuit of his goals was already genocidal. It is simply impossible to imagine how his goals could have been realized without an implementation at the very least of an ethnic cleansing of Poles, Russians, and other Slavs. Irrespective of whether Hitler himself fully realized the genocidal developmental logic of his geopolitical goals, there can be no doubt what his preferred final solution to the Jewish question was. As the letter of Ulle Wille to Rudolf Hess from late 1922 revealed, by that time Hitler and Hess must have already floated the idea of using machine guns to exterminate the Jews. In addition, in an interview that Hitler gave to a Catalonian journalist not long before his putsch attempt of 1923, he was even more explicit. In response to Hitler's statement that carrying out a pogrom in Munich was pointless, as afterward the Jews in the rest of the country would still continue to dominate politics and finance, the journalist asked him, "What do you want to do, kill them all overnight?" Hitler replied, "That would of course be the best solution, and if one could pull it off, Germany would be saved. But that is not possible. I have looked into this problem from all sides. It is not possible. Instead of thanking us, as they should, the world would attack us from all sides." He added, "Hence, only expulsion is left. A mass expulsion." Hitler's answer is revelatory in explaining the emergence of the Holocaust, as he makes it perfectly clear that his preference by 1923 was for genocide, but that, if an outright genocide was not possible, he would be pragmatic and go for the second-best option, mass expulsion. What he had had in mind when talking about mass expulsions becomes apparent from the temporal context in which the interview took place. As people on the radical right in Munich had just been exposed to Hans Tropp's article about the Armenian lessons for the Jewish question, Hitler's response could hardly mean anything but a championing of Armenian-inspired ethnic cleansing. Once in power, Hitler initially encouraged Jewish emigration. Yet his support for emigration has to be understood as a third-best solution, fueled by tactical pragmatism rather than as evidence that he had not yet envisioned his preferred solution. As a savvy political operator, he also understood that at times he had to downplay his anti-Semitism. For instance, during the election campaigns of 1932, he barely mentioned Jews. Nevertheless, once he would pursue his two primary political goals in tandem, the creation of a sufficiently large Germany through the grabbing of new territory in the East, and the removal of Jews from the state he was attempting to create, as the harmful influence of Jews, according to him, was the primary reason for Germany's internal weakness, one thing was clear. Hitler no longer had any plausible alternative to either outright genocide or ethnic cleansing with genocidal consequences. Expulsion was not a practical solution in wartime. There simply was no country to which Jews could have been sent. And unlike in the Armenian case in the First World War, due to the realities of Germany's war fortunes in the 1940s, Jews could not be dislocated from their core areas of settlement to some other area under German rule. It may well be true that, in a technical sense, the physical extermination of Jews in Poland began with decisions made on the ground, without clear orders coming from Berlin. However, they were only made because Hitler had embarked on a war aimed at the simultaneous grabbing of territory and removal of Jews, in a context in which his preferred solution arguably always had been genocidal, as had been the developmental logic of his actions and intentions. Moreover, orders coming directly from Hitler had started the war and directly resulted in subsequent orders by Hitler that mandated rounding up the Jews of Poland as well as mowing down, by machine gun, the Jews of the Soviet Union. Thus, the idea that the Holocaust only started in the second half of 1941, as in when hundreds of thousands of Jews had already been killed in the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, does not add up. Their murder emanated from Hitler's desire to create a German empire not only with sufficient territory, but one that had been cleared of Jews in a way that he had already envisaged as early as 1922 and 1923, as evident in Hesse's and his own interactions with Ulrich Wille and the Catalonian journalist. Once the systematic killing of Jews in Poland got under way, there was no real alternative left for decision-makers on the ground to making genocidal choices due to decisions Hitler had taken earlier on. In other words, Hitler's earlier decisions had set his administrators in Poland on a path on which the only plausible solutions to the problems they had to face were genocidal. Any belief that initiatives resulting in the Holocaust genuinely had come from below is thus an illusion. Hitler himself lay at the heart of the emergence of the Holocaust. The progressive radicalization of Hitler's policies, and of the Third Reich in general, was also a direct result of his metamorphosis between 1919 and the mid-1920s, for a different reason. Due to his narcissism and his desire to stand out in the busy marketplace of Munich in post-revolutionary Bavaria, Hitler almost always tried to be more extreme than his competitors so as to attract attention. This had set in motion a process of progressive radicalization that would be fed by confirmation cycles. In the process of further developing the ideas to which people had responded the most in his speeches, he made his ideas even more extreme to get even more of a response, thus setting off a self-reinforcing cycle of radicalization. Hitler's hunger for ever more attention was ultimately his own undoing. It planted the seed of the Third Reich's self-destruction, even though, of course, many other factors helped drive the radicalization of Nazi Germany. Hitler's narcissism, and its reinforcement by his admirers, as well as the confirmation cycles through which he went, left him little choice but always to go for more extreme solutions. In that sense, Hitler's Germany was a vehicle with no reverse gear and with no brakes, which inevitably at some point would go over a cliff. None of this is to suggest that if Hitler had made it to Austria in the wake of his failed coup, or if, like Dietrich Eckart, he had died in 1923, Germany would not have taken an authoritarian route through the 1930s and 1940s. After all, in the interwar period, liberal democracy fell from within everywhere to the east of the Rhine and to the south of the Alps, with the notable exception of Czechoslovakia. And elsewhere in Europe it often only barely survived. Likewise, none of this is to take the responsibility away from the millions of Germans who supported Hitler and who carried out the crimes of Nazi Germany. Without them, Hitler would have remained a nobody. However, the story of his becoming does reveal a crucial insight, that the void left by the collapse of liberal democracy in Germany and filled by Hitler, rather than by most others among the demagogues in the making who were competing with him, increased manifoldly the risks of a cataclysmic war and genocide. The story of Hitler's metamorphosis is equally that of how demagogues are made, and of the making of a particular one who should not be mistaken as representing all demagogues. It is a cautionary tale of what happens when extreme economic volatility and breakdown, feelings of disaffection as well as of imminent national and personal decline, come together. It is about how new radical leaders are made when liberal democracy and globalism are in great crisis, and when that crisis is translated into a yearning for strong men and novel kinds of leaders. As history teaches, certain common structural conditions make the emergence of demagogues possible. Yet the history of Europe in the 1920s and 1930s, and of the world throughout the 20th century, reveals that demagogues come in several varieties. They range from populists with no genuine core beliefs to ideologues of various political convictions. They include rational as well as irrational actors. They encompass actors whose personality will always drive them to the most extreme solutions and who never know where to stop, thus planting the seed of their regime's self-destruction, as well as those with temperate personalities whose regime can survive for decades. They also range from those believing that any compromise other than a tactical one is rotten to others who ultimately believe that politics is the art of compromise. The fundamental problem in foretelling what sort of an emergent demagogue will become lies in the common style of their demagoguery when they first appear in the public arena. Their common language and style, and their common claim to be outsiders who can represent the real interests of the people, blocks from view what kind of demagogue they will likely become. This is why it tends to be impossible to foretell whether somebody will turn into a reincarnated Hitler, a Franco, a Lenin, or into a late 19th century kind of populist who, while flirting with authoritarianism, ultimately manages to withstand its seduction. In short, when confronted with new, emerging demagogues, history may not be able to tell us until it is too late whether the writing on the wall points toward a Hitler, an Albrecht, or an entirely different person. However, the conditions that imperil liberal democracy and make the emergence of demagogues possible can be detected early on, be responded to, and thus contained before they become as acute as they were in the 1920s. Indeed, we must detect them early on, before they become as acute as during the time of Hitler's metamorphosis. After all, National Socialism was born during the great crisis of liberalism and globalization of the late 19th century. Communism, too, was on the rise during that era, and anarchist terror was rampant. The fabric that held globalization, common norms, and nascent liberal democracy together was already destroyed by populists in the decades that followed the crash of the Viennese Stock Exchange in 1873, even though their ultimate goals tended to be very different from the ones of demagogues during the world's age of extremes between 1914 and 1989. And yet it had been the destruction of that fabric in the late 19th century that had made the emergence of demagogues in the early 20th century possible. Without the destruction of the fabric of the world's first age of globalization, there would have been no Horthy, Metaxas, Stalin, Mussolini, Hitler, Ho Chi Minh, Franco, Tito, or Mao. Whether one day there will be a new age of tyrants will not only depend on our vigilance against future Hitlers. More important, it will be determined by our willingness to protect and mend the fabric of liberal democracy of our own age of globalization before conditions become such that demagogues of the worst kind will flourish. This has been a Hachette audio production of Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi, written by Thomas Weber, read by Alex Hyde White. Produced by William Dufries. Directed and recorded by Samir Besirevich of Punch Audio. Post-production by Mind's Eye Productions. Production supervised by Elise Green. Becoming Hitler is also available in print and digital formats from Basic Books, an imprint of Perseus Books, a division of Hachette Book Group. For more Hachette Audio productions, visit us at hachetteaudio.com. Thank you for listening. Text copyright 2017 by Thomas Weber. Audio production copyright 2017. Hachette Audio. All rights reserved. Hachette Book Group supports the right to free expression and the value of copyright. The purpose of copyright is to encourage writers and artists to produce the creative works that enrich our culture. The duplicating, uploading, and distribution of this book without permission is a theft of the author's intellectual property. If you would like permission to use material from the book, other than for review purposes, please contact permissions@hbgusa.com. Thank you for your support of the author's rights.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.